Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm turning off now. Thank you, bye.
Okay.
I see it is 10 o'clock now, but I think we're just going to give people a couple more minutes to get into the room in case they're having any difficulties. So we'll begin very shortly. Yes, welcome everyone to this year's webinar called Flowers and Pollinators. Welcome back to everyone who was with us last year, and also, of course, welcome to everyone who is new to this webinar this year. I'm just going to start with some practical information. The first thing is that this webinar is being recorded because we want to share this to everyone who wants to look at this later, and also for those who couldn't participate today, will be able to watch this some other day. So if you're not comfortable showing your face in a recording, you can have your cameras turned off, but hopefully everyone will show their face when they're presenting, as it is very nice to see a face to their voice. Yes. So for those who are not familiar with our project, this is a international collaborative project together with Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Estonia. Last year, we had a project on pollinators in agriculture in general. And this year, we have focused more on flowers and using native plants when we want to help wild pollinators. And this project is funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. So a very big thank you to them, so we can actually do this this year as well. Today we have a lot of different speakers. I'm so much looking forward to hearing every single one of the presentations. We will have people speak from a little after 10 to almost 11:30. Then we will have a short lunch break for 35 minutes before we continue on until 2 o'clock. We hope to be able to upload everyone's presentations after the webinar. So if any of your presenters are not comfortable with that, just let me know at some point. So we won't upload them on the internet later. We want to, in this project, always communicate as much information, make everything available for everyone at some point. That is what we want to do. So if something is not supposed to be recorded or put out later, just let me know. We also have a tight schedule, so I will, if anyone is looking to be going over their time, when there's 3 minutes left, I will give a small warning, and I will also give another warning when it's 1 minute left, because we do have to keep the schedule as well as possible. If there are time for questions, I will try to read them after the presentations, and the presenters can answer. If there isn't time, I will ask every presenter if they're available for questions in the chat during the rest of the webinar. So you can ask questions in the Q&A section, and if you want to have more general questions or have a discussion, the chat is open for everyone. Let's see, I just need to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. That was the practical information, was it? Yes, I think it is. So I wasn't thinking of talking for 15 minutes because that's a lot of time for only introducing this webinar. So instead, I think we can just actually start the presenters so we can have more time for questions. So if the first presenter, Anne Erland Eskildsen, was a senior advisor in Verges from Denmark. She's going to be talking about the Danish farmers' action for wild bees. I can perhaps mention that Denmark was supposed to be the host country this year, and we were supposed to be in Denmark for this webinar, but unfortunately, due to the pandemic being so uncertain, we chose to have it digital this year as well. And thankfully, a lot of people are watching right now, so we can feel better about doing this digital. So we wanted to have some farmers from Denmark come and talk about what they're doing in Denmark for pollinators. So Anne, are you with me?
I'm right here. Is the sound
Yes.
okay?
Yes,
Okay,
it
and
is.
I guess I can just share my screen.
Yes, you can. I'm gonna stop sharing mine. And you can just share your screen and start whenever you are ready.
Okay, does this look okay?
Yes, if you put it in full mode.
It is in full mode. At least on my screen it is.
Aha. Den er ikke det, se. Du ser ingenting.
If you have two screens, then it may be that it is showing like not the correct screen.
I only have one screen.
Okay.
We still see the menu and everything, but isn't it's not in presenter mode in
Let me try
PowerPoint?
again.
There is this mode called lysbildefremvisning in Norwegian.
Let's see. Maybe I can just share my screen with you. Sorry, we haven't practiced this beforehand.
That's okay. Now it works.
Now it works?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you very much. And hello, everybody out there behind your screens. It's nice to see so many participants. It's sad that we can't actually see each other. But as Eileen said, my name is Anne Eskilsen, and I'm a specialist working in Verges, the Danish Knowledge Center for Agriculture. My background is that I'm a biologist. Actually, I have a background working with butterfly ecology. But now I'm working in Verges, helping farmers to improve their actions for biodiversity. So, and I'm not alone. I actually work with a quite big group of people where we've grown a lot recently. So I guess one of the first ways to show that that Danish farmers are actually working seriously with biodiversity is to look at this quite large group of specialists now working in this area. We've grown from just 3 people to now 7 people within just the past few years. So this is a really nice development, and we're doing a lot of cool projects. So, and of course, pollinators is one thing that's taken up a lot of our time recently because it's become such a big issue. So, and that's one of the things I've been working with a lot. So, as I'm sure many of you know, if you ever speak to farmers, often they feel that they receive a lot of the blame for insect declines. You can argue that this is fair. Of course, farmers have had their part in the declines in biodiversity and in insect declines. Of course they have, but when we go out and try to speak to them about how to improve their actions for biodiversity, we try not to hit them too much on the head. We try to have a more positive outlook. So we try to explain to them that they can actually also be a part of the solution, and we genuinely believe that this is true. So some of my screen is actually hidden from this. Can you see the top part of my presentation, or is it hidden by this bar from you?
No, we see it.
You see it. Okay, maybe I can just move it. That's fine. Okay. Yes, so like I said, when we speak to farmers, many of them actually have a genuine interest in contributing to insect protection, especially these past few years where it's become a really big issue in our society. But often we also experience that they are in big need of evidence-based guidelines. I was speaking one day to Henrik, this farmer, and he said, well, you know, and I'm actually just a mechanic by trade. I mean, how am I supposed to know what to do to improve conditions for wild pollinators on my farm? But this is our job. So this is what me and my colleagues try to help these farmers with. One thing that we often see is that that many farmers, in lack of better knowledge, they often resort to very short-term actions, such as flower strips, which have become extremely popular in Denmark. We see a lot of these flower strips But what they don't realize is that many of these short-term actions happening on the fields are not very cost effective. And at the same time, they actually forget to prioritize some of these more permanent actions that we know have a much greater value for the pollinators. So just this photo shows one example. I was visiting a farmer and she'd made this really nice, huge flower strip in her field, but she'd completely forgotten about this actually very valuable nature area, which was right behind it. She'd never actually looked at it and she didn't realize that there are a lot of rare species of pollinators living there. So this is a good example how we need to help them focus more on what is actually cost efficient. Another reason why this is starting to matter more and more is that we see much more increased expectations from consumers, but also from, for example, mortgage lenders, which the farmers are going to when they need to borrow money. And they're actually really starting to increase their expectations for what the farmers need to do for biodiversity on their farm. So the farmers need to know a lot more than they did just a few years ago about how to go about this. And as an answer to this, to try to kind of help our farmers what to do, we called it the Bee Campaign a few years ago, where we invited a number of experts, so some scientists working with wild pollinators, but also some practitioners who had a lot of experience doing management for wild pollinators. And we asked them to help us try to identify the 10 most important actions that farmers could do on their farm to improve conditions for pollinators. And after they'd identified these 10 different actions, we asked them to prioritize them. And this sometimes rubs people the wrong way, because sometimes people just want to say that, you know, just doing something is always good. But for us, it's very important to show the farmers that there are a number of different actions that they can take, but they don't always have the same effect. So it's a way for them to also choose the most efficient actions that will work on their farm. So I thought I would just go through them with you. To give you some examples of what our farmers are doing. So if we just take them from the top, sorry, so I forgot to say that the way that to show the farmers how efficient these different actions are is by scoring them from 1 to 10. So 1 bumblebee is the least efficient and 10 bumblebees is the most efficient. So you have to try to kind of choose the most efficient actions that will work with the conditions that you have on your farm. And I actually had it translated into English last year. So now hopefully all of you can see it and understand it. So I'll just take them, run through them all quickly. So the first action up here in the top left corner is to protect and improve small biotopes between fields, for example, road verges, field margins, and hedgerows. So all farmers have these small biotopes. So the point is to try to protect them, and if possible, to establish uncultivated buffer zones around them to protect them from pesticides and fertilizers. So that's kind of a medium action. It gives you 6 bumblebees. The next one, number 2, is to convert unproductive parts of the field into permanent nature. So a lot of farmers have these little, so they're all illustrated on this drawing. So this would be an example here. There's a small, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's a small corner here down by the number 2 where there's a small unproductive part of the farm the farmer could take out. And this will give you 5 bumblebees. Number 3 is to adopt an insect-friendly mowing practice. So try to avoid mowing flowering biotopes in the summer and the early fall, but instead to mow in late spring and late fall to improve flowering, and of course to always remove grass cuttings. This will give you 8 bumblebees. Number 4 is to minimize drift of pesticides and fertilizers. So there are a lot of different things the farmers can do to keep pesticides and fertilizers on the field where they belong and not out in the nature areas close by. So that's 5 bumblebees. Number 5 is to protect and improve high value nature areas. So if you have valuable areas on your farm, for instance, dry grassland, meadows, heaths, a lot of farmers have these areas and might not be aware that these are actually the most valuable parts of their farm for biodiversity and for pollinators, of course. So to have focus on these areas, if possible, to graze them. at low densities. So this is actually the action that gives you most bumblebees, 10. Down here, number 6 is to protect old trees. We see a lot of farmers still in Denmark that are removing their old and their dead trees. And this is one of the actions that is very easy to do. So you actually don't have to do anything, just stop removing your old trees. And that will give you 7 bumblebees. Down here, number 7, making flower strips. So we're all familiar with these flower strips. It's also been a big topic here on these webinars. And it gave us quite a lot of controversy that this action was only given 1 bumblebee. But the scientists behind these recommendations tell us that actually this is one of the least efficient things that you can do for insects on your farm as a farmer, because all the things we've already talked about in these webinars, it's short term, it's on the field, it's being plowed, it's probably a big sink for pollinators. So many farmers are surprised by this, but we also see that they actually, once they see it and they see that there's so many other things you can do that are more efficient, they try to do other things. Okay, number 8 is making natural insect hotels. So leaving piles of rocks or branches, or even an old bale of straw. Number 9 is leaving dead wood anywhere that you can. So protect dead trees, but also if you have to cut a tree down, leave the dead wood where it is. That's 8 bumblebees. And finally, the last one is to plant flowering trees in hedgerows wherever you can. And if you already have an old hedgerow, don't remove it, but try to incorporate flowering trees and bushes. Okay, so so that's our insect campaign, or our bee campaign. I should say this is not supposed to be seen as a scientific tool. It's a tool for dissemination. So what it really can do is to show and help farmers how to prioritize the actions that they take. And I would say that it's actually given us a lot of positive feedback from nature NGOs and from other people working with biodiversity. They were quite surprised to see the farming, to see SIGIS publish something like this, because we think that it's quite transparent and it's quite it really shows you what the effect of the actions you do. So it's really a way to try to avoid greenwashing. We've made fact sheets for each of these different actions. They're only in Danish, unfortunately. So far, we haven't translated them yet. But so if, as a farmer, you're interested in doing one of these actions, you can go in and read the fact sheet and find out exactly how to do it. Just look at the time. Okay. When we started this campaign, it was possible to go in and kind of register as a bee-friendly farmer. And this is just the map showing, so this is from 2019. But actually, quite a lot of farmers have gone in and registered as bee-friendly farmers. So this is a campaign that's really gotten out to a lot of farmers. Okay, just a few other examples of things that we do. We've recently also had a lot of focus on wildflowers. So, so I've done different campaigns to try to educate farmers about the value of wildflowers, how to identify wildflowers, so they know when they see anyway, when they see some of these flowers that they dandelion. Sorry. So they know that these are actually good for pollinators and not just weeds, and how they can improve conditions for wildflowers on their farms. Last year, I also did a campaign about dead wood. So this is another ongoing theme. We see really a lot of farmers removing dead wood from their hedgerows and other places on their farms because they don't realize the value that they have for pollinators and for biodiversity in general. So this is something we've tried to focus on a lot. Last year, we also published a textbook for farming students. So in Denmark now, every future farmer that goes to farming school has a full week about biodiversity. And a colleague and I wrote a textbook for that subject, which of course covers a lot of more subjects, but pollinators are of course mentioned in this book. So that's another great way of teaching young future farmers about the value of pollinators and how to help them. Finally, I'd like to just say a few words about our one-on-one consulting. So these campaigns are really nice and they reach out to a lot of people, but I find that one of the things that gives us most value is when we have a chance to go out and speak to farmers individually. So we try to do that as much as we can. And in our team, we have two different kind of products that we operate with when we go out to visit farmers. Was that a sign to me, Erin? No, okay, I thought you were saying stop. Okay. Okay. Okay, so when we go out and visit farmers, we have two different kind of levels of consulting, and one is called a focus plan. So focus plans are for farmers that actually own or manage high value nature areas. We see a lot of farmers that do. Many of them know something about it, but a lot of them don't actually know very much. This is a nice example of Henrik, who is managing several hundred hectares on Faner, which is one of the most valuable nature areas in Denmark. And like I said, when we visited him the first time, he said, "I'm just a mechanic. I don't really know what I'm doing." So we went out and we did a thorough kind of, we looked at his entire farm, looked at what kind of biodiversity is there, lots of great pollinators living in this area. What is his current management and how can we kind of try to make these things meet? So finding a management, finding management options for him that work for him, but are also optimal for biodiversity. So what we do is we make a focus plan where we go through all of these things and give him some specific focus areas to work on to improve conditions for instance, pollinators on his farm. And I just have a nice quote from him. He said when we visited him the last time, "Before I didn't really notice the flowers and insects, green grass for my cows, that was my main focus. Today I know to keep an eye out for the number of butterflies, bees and flowers on my land because they reflect the value of my management." So that's a really nice thing when we have farmers that kind of suddenly have this change in mindset and can see the value of managing for pollinators. So that's quite a success. When we visit kind of, you could say, ordinary farmers who don't manage very high value nature areas, but just have, you know, the ordinary small biotopes around the farm, we do what we call a naturcheck, where we also run through the entire farm and find out where are there valuable nature areas, what is their potential, you could say, for biodiversity, and how well is this potential realized and how could it be realized more. So this is an example from Ole, one of our farmers. So one of my colleagues went to visit him and she identified 7 different focus areas on the farm that he could work on that have different potential. So for example, his meadows have a very high potential for biodiversity. And he's realized it quite well, but there's still a slight possibility to improve. So these faded stars show that there's still some improvement that could be made. So I have another quote from Ole. He said, "Naturcheck has inspired me to think in new ways. The norm is that old trees are ugly, and before I would burn them in my furnace, even though they had little value. Today, I leave them behind with good conscience because I know that they're good for the biodiversity on my farm, and I'd much rather spend time with my family than tidying up around the farm." So that's another nice example of a farmer that's kind of realized the potential for increasing biodiversity on his farm. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me. In a minute, you'll get to see a nice video from another farmer that we've been working with, Peter Handbook, who did another step further. He's actually converted some of his former farmland into a valuable flower-rich grassland, or at least it will be in a few years when it's developed a bit more. So that's another nice, inspiring example of how, when we get to do this one-to-one consulting with farmers and have a good chat with them about the potential for increasing biodiversity on their farms, what's actually possible. So you'll get to see that video in just a minute. So yeah, but that was it from me. I wonder if we have time for questions, or have I used up my time?
As I didn't talk too long, I think we can use a couple of minutes on questions. First of all, thank you so much for this great presentation. And there have certainly come in some questions. I'm going to start with the Q&A questions first. They are asking if the picture is possible to find online, and I think they're referring to the poster with the different.
Yeah, I have it. I have it as a PDF. I can send it to you afterwards. So yeah, for sure.
Yes, great. Then we can send it to others after the webinar if they're interested in that. And next, just a question regarding mowing in spring. If we take flying insects that emerge in early spring, such as some bumblebees or other solitary bees, can that be a negative impact on these populations, although they might forage resources also a lot from shrubs and early flowering trees?
For the moment, yeah, I mean, I guess if you look at different pollinators, they would all they might have different requirements for when the optimal time for mowing is. So what we say is that as a rule of thumb, it's a good idea to not mow during the summer. So spring and fall is better, but then we say what's actually most important is that you don't mow everything at the same time, that you have some variation, so that you don't completely remove all flowering resources at the same time, but try to do some variation in your mowing. So hopefully that will benefit the early species as well.
Great. Hi, Anna. Nice presentation. Certainly, small uncultivated areas and high-value nature areas are of benefit. However, is connectivity between these areas important? And if so, how do you help farmers improve connectivity or the heterogeneity of habitat types on their farm and their surrounding landscape?
Well, I guess what you're thinking about is corridors. I mean, the advice we give farmers is to not focus so much on physical connectivity, but to focus more on improving the individual habitats, so that size is more important than connectivity. So if you have a valuable area, then it's more important to improve to make it bigger, to make it more stable than the actual connectivity. I guess from my own knowledge of the research behind corridors, it shows that physical connectivity is not as important as size. So size matters more.
Great. Converting unproductive parts of the field to nature may be risky depending on the national legislation. Is this farmland is earmarked as nature by authorities? This devalues the land economically. What is the Danish approach or solution to this?
That's a quite complicated question, but many places it is actually possible for farmers to do. It's not always very attractive for them to take out parts of their field, simply because it's not, it doesn't give an economic incentive. As far as the legislation, it's only a problem if you have protected species that inhabit the area. But in Denmark, we have actually a possibility to have a permanent right to always farm your land again. So if you establish a new nature area, you can say, I want to maintain my right to always to farm it in the future. And then it's only if very rare species, protected species, move in, that you're not allowed to do that. But that doesn't happen very often on former agricultural land anyway. So yeah.
Great. And if a field is left for wildflower friendly grassland, it is probably turning into a forest at some point. How do you manage this?
For us, it's not so important to label what type of nature it is. Open habitats are good for some species, and woodland habitats are good for other species. What we try to advise farmers to do is to establish low intensity grazing, and then see what happens. So it's more important to have a varied landscape with many different types of resources than trying to maintain it necessarily as open land, for example. So, but grazing is of course important.
Great. The 1B on flowering strips is discouraging. If flowering resources are scarce, it seems like they would be a bit more valuable, especially in combination with other measures that conserve some nesting habitats.
Absolutely, they can have some value, but it was important for us to show that a flower strip is not a permanent habitat. So it can be a foraging resource during certain times of the year, but it's not a place where the most species can breed or overwinter. So, and also from research that I've seen, at least many of the rare species that we should prioritize most in our actions are actually not benefited from these flower strips because of the species of flowers that we use in flowering strips. So so it's if you make a permanent flowering strip, then that's of course something completely different, but we don't often see that. And on farmland, it's almost never possible because they're often overtaken by some of these problem species, for example, thistles that farmers by no means want close to their fields. So if these species start to invade the flower strips, then they will plow them anyway. So yeah.
Yes, great.
So discouraging maybe, but I think it was also an important point to show farmers that there are other ways of improving conditions for pollinators than just flower strips.
Absolutely. I don't think we can make all of the questions, but we can take one more at least. Regarding number 3, and I think this is also referring to the poster with the 10 measures, have had some discussion about staggered mowing for more continuous flowering. Good for some flowers, but not all. This seems more practical for the farmers also. Is no mowing between X and Y too simplistic?
Absolutely no mowing at all. Was that the question?
Yes, no mowing between one
Yeah.
part and another part.
I guess no mowing at all is problematic in Denmark because we have such a high level of nutrients most places. So if you don't mow, then it will just become you know, very dense grass or other of these competitive species. So mowing is quite important, at least most places in Denmark, if you want to retain at least some flowers.
Great. That was all the time we had for the questions in this presentation. Will your presentation be available later?
Yes, for sure.
Yes, great. Will you be in chat to answer other questions if
I'll try
anyone...
to stay online at least until lunch. So
yes, great. Thank you so much, Anne.
You're welcome.
We are moving on to the next farmer, Jan Sebstrip, who is presenting a film from Denmark because we wanted to show a farm in Denmark since we couldn't be there physical this time. So we wanted to show them to you digitally. That was a weird word for now. Jan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Anna mentioned a farmer, Peter, that we visited here in October and took a short video, 3-minute video, where he tells why and how he converted a wheat field to dry meadow or wild the area you see is 12 hectares, and he started changing it from a normal farm field to wild pasture in 2018. And he did that by, first he closed all the drainage system, which you will see in the video, that resulted in a couple of small lakes on this field. Then he did a deep plowing to bring mineral soil with less nutrients to the top, and then harrowed it, and then he just let it lay there. He didn't sow any wildflower or grass. He just let it lay there. When you see the video, you can see that the surrounding area is a dry meadow. It has been for many years. So any plants that you see in this field has migrated from the surrounding wild nature area. Yes, I think that's a short introduction to the video. So can you put it on, Erin?
Yes, I can try to share it. Let's see. Share sound. I hope the sound also works for you.
Hej, jeg hedder Peter Handbook. Jeg er landmand. Lige nu der står vi på vores nye overdrev, som vi har etableret i 2019. Grunden til, at vi ikke længere dyrker marken landbrugsmæssigt, det er, at det er en vanskelig dyrkbar mark, og at jeg interesserer mig meget for natur. Og så også fordi, at vi havde den danske naturfond, som gerne ville gå ind og støtte projektet med at lave om til natur. Det, der er godt ved et overdrev, det er jo alle de blomsterarter, der kommer. Der er den mangfoldighed af vidt forskellige blomsterarter, som bibringer bier, sommerfugle, svirrefluer og i det hele taget insekter. Det, jeg har ud af at have sådan en areal, det er jo glæden. Det er jo glæden ved at komme ud. Jeg synes, det er en fornøjelse hver gang, jeg kommer ud der. Der er jo altid noget nyt. Og så ved jeg, at der sker så stor forandring hele tiden her. Fra at vi i 18 høstede den sidste hvedemark, hvor der ikke var anden hvede, til vi i dag står i et hav af landmænd, vil sige ukrudtsarter. Jeg vil jo sige overdrevsarter, som er rigtig gode for naturen. Og vi ved jo, at vi skal gøre mere for naturen. Den er i krise, så jeg glæder mig over rent mentalt, at jeg kan have sådan et areal her. Vi har ikke gjort andet end reolpløje, hav en gang, og så har arealet passet sig selv siden da. Og fordi vi ikke pløjer jorden mere, så giver det jo også noget uforstyrret jord, hvor insekterne de kan lave deres gange og yngle i og rundt omkring, fordi der er bare jord rundt omkring os. Det er jo vores private grund, men vi har jo lavet en aftale med den danske naturfond, som støtter projektet, og det er blevet tinglyst, at det er åbent for offentligheden, og at vi er tinglyst, at det skal være natur i al evighed. Men fremtidsplanerne, det er jo, at nu kommer der vildheste, der skal græs på arealet og lave helårsafgræsning. De marker, vi stadigvæk dyrker, de bliver dyrket økologisk med plantebaserede fødevarer. Så det er sådan set de planer, vi har indtil videre. Men vi har hele tiden noget, der kører herop, så lurer mig om ikke, der kommer mere også senere.
Great. Let's see, there might be some questions. No, it seems like the questions are from the last presentation. But thank you so much for this video. Do you want to say something more, Jan, before we continue on?
There's one thing that is not mentioned in the video. That is, there's a small parking lot at the side of the field, and they put up a poster telling about the project. So when people visit this area, they can see why he did it and what you can find on this area. I think that's all I have to say about this video.
Yes. Thank you so much. It doesn't seem like there are any questions, but will you be in the chat during this webinar to answer questions in case?
Yes, I'll be in the seminar at until 2 o'clock.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We'll just continue on. The next is Yoko Louise Dupont from Aarhus University in Denmark. She will be talking about bees and flowers in road verges. And Yoko, are you here with me?
Yes, and I'll try to share my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
You can start whenever you're ready.
Yes. Okay. So, do you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Yes, so I will be telling you about bees and flowers in road verges. And first of all, I would like to thank for this invitation to speak today. Being a pollination ecologist is very much in my interest, and flowers and pollinators really is central to my work. Last year I was invited to talk about wildflower seed mixtures, and this year I had to think a little bit carefully about what to talk about. But I really wanted to tell you a little bit about natural plant communities and bee communities. And this talk is inspired by an ongoing project that I'm participating in about flora and bee fauna in road verges in Denmark. And I've listed my collaborators from Denmark who participated in the fieldwork, in addition to Markus Sydenholm from Norway. It's a Norwegian-Danish project. And this picture shows one of the particularly flower-rich road verges, and you also find a lot of bee species in those verges. But before I start talking about this project, I would like to take a step back and look at the big picture. So globally, we have actually 64 million kilometers of roads. Well, that's a lot of roads. And in the EU, we have 6 million kilometers of roads. And this number is still increasing. So road density is relatively high in Scandinavia, maybe except for the north. And this figure below shows the global pattern of road density. The colors indicate the amount of areas which are free of roads. And the red color is the roads and their 1 kilometer buffers, so that the red regions actually show regions where you never have areas which are more than 1 kilometer from a road. And that includes Denmark, where I live. And I thought that was a little bit thought-provoking. So that in terms of conserving natural habitats without any anthropogenic impact, a number of environmental problems are associated with roads, and these include, as listed in this paper, for instance, chemical pollution and noise disturbance and mortality of wildlife due to collision. But when we're talking about flora and insect fauna, then the problems associated are specifically associated with habitat degradation and fragmentation, which is in general bad for organisms. But in addition, also an increase in connectivity of habitats, which can be actually both good and bad. So as already mentioned, we have a very high density of roads in Denmark. And if we look at the land use distribution in Denmark, then actually more than 70% of the land area is occupied either by farmland or by production forest. And this leaves 12% here to cities and roads and 14% to nature. So that the area covered by roads and cities is actually comparable to what is left of natural areas in Denmark. So it's actually some significant area. And some road verges, for instance, along motorways, are deliberately sown with wildflower mixtures. But here I would like to focus more on these natural road verges. And often these are unfortunately quite species poor in Denmark, and they are often cut. But some of them are more species rich, as the upper picture. So in the Nordic countries, the road sites are they often resemble semi-natural grasslands, road verges could actually be considered as fragments of natural habitat, supporting at least some of the flora and fauna which is traditionally found in grasslands. In Denmark, which is generally very intensively farmed, the area of natural areas is very limited, including these semi-natural grasslands. In Norway and Sweden, the situation is perhaps a little bit different because you have more areas of semi-natural and natural grasslands, so that these road verges could potentially be habitats which are fragmented and attracting plants and bees away from these larger semi-natural areas and therefore acting as ecological sinks. But in Denmark, these road verges may actually be some of the most valuable natural habitats in the landscape. But in any case, road verges, they vary a lot in quality, and they range from very species poor, mainly grass dominated verges like in the lower picture here, to a more diverse plant community, supporting a lot of nectar and pollen providing plant species. In Denmark, many of the road verges are poor because they have been recently cut, and also they're grass dominated because of the nutrient enrichment. For instance, when you leave the verge cuttings, and some of them also next to agricultural fields, and then they receive some of the fertilizer spilloffs. But in general, many factors affect the plant diversity in the verges. In particular, management is important, and in particular, cutting is important. If you cut the verges frequently, then you remove flowers as well as buds, and it takes a lot of time for flowers or plants to set flowers. But the timing of the cutting is also important, so that if you cut early in the season, then you tend to remove all the flowers and the buds. But if you cut at the end of the season, then you don't remove that many flowers. In Denmark, I know that some communities are also making experiments of adjusting the height of the cutting, so that if you maybe do not cut to very low heights, then you actually preserve some of the flowers. And then you can have other management practices which affect the flower composition and the flower abundance. For instance, salting in winter will affect composition. Soil nutrients are already mentioned, and the age and the history of the verge, of course, also has some influence on the composition of the flora. And then something very important also is some characteristics of the roads, the road width, and traffic intensity, and speed limits. Some of these are also quite related, and they create barriers and affect this connectivity across larger geographical areas for the seed dispersal. And then finally, of course, the local landscape and the distance to source areas where the seeds are dispersed from is also important. So there is general evidence that road verges are important habitats for pollinators, especially in intensively managed farmlands where floral resources can be scarce. So this figure is from a study in the UK, and it shows the annual nectar productivity in both areas, polygons, and in linear features of different habitat types, and the different habitat types are shown here in different colors. And then you have pairs of area and linear features for all the habitats. And you can generally see that the nectar content in the linear habitats, which include the road verges, are generally higher than in the areas. And this is particularly important in arable areas, which are the orange. So if we look at the bee species richness and the abundance in the road verges, then the bees present in the road verges are likely first and foremost dependent on which flowers are available. And the figure here to the right shows a relationship between the number of species of bees, which are the black dots here, and the number of all insect species, which are the white dots. And you can see this increasing trend. And this particular study is for flower strips, sown flower strips, but this relationship between the number of bee species and the number of insects or plant species is actually rather general. But other factors also affect the bees in the verges, like for plants, you have the surrounding landscape and the distance to source areas, in addition to the distance to nesting sites for bees. Again, the age and the history of the row verges are important. In addition to these road characteristics, the road width, the traffic intensity, and speed limits, which also affect the dispersal of bees. And I've actually, for the past days, been reading a PhD thesis by Juliana Danielle Ferreira, who will defend her PhD thesis in SLU tomorrow. And she's been working on the effect of these linear features, landscape features, on biodiversity of both plants and pollinators. And she has found out that actually the risk of collision for bumblebees is much related to these road characteristics, and that collision risk is associated mainly with the nest-seeking bumblebees rather than foraging bumblebees. And what she also found was that that connectivity of these populations are affected by roads, so that pollinators, they tend to move much more along the roads than crossing the roads. So that actually affects the dispersal of the bees a lot. So this brings me actually to our own project, which is called Metacarpnet. It's an ongoing research project which is led by Markus Svalheim from NINA in Norway. And in this project, we are investigating how plant bee networks are assembled. We focus on the plant bee networks in road verges, but the idea generally applies to all pollination networks in any habitat. So we work in two regions. One is in the Oslo region in Norway and another one in Jutland in Denmark. And I will not go into the details of this project, but the main idea is that the interaction network is assembled from local communities, and which is, again, the species presence is dependent on large-scale species, regional species distributions, which are shaped by climatic and edaphic factors. And in addition to some local context where the bees have to have nesting sites available within their flight distance. And then finally, whether an interaction is formed between a bee species and a plant species depends on the preferred diets of the bee species and the phenologies, which makes interactions likely to be established or not likely to be established. So this is the main idea of the project. And to support this, we collected bees from flowering plants in road verges in 30 different sites in Denmark and a comparable number of sites in Norway. And here you can see the sites in Denmark, which are all located within the same region. All sites are separated by at least 2 kilometers, but most of them are separated by much more, so that we don't expect that bees fly between the different sites. And we tried to select verges which were unlikely to be cut during the summer. So that would be in loops in motorways and along tracks for bikes only. And all of these sites were visited 3 times during the season, in early, mid, and late summer. And at each visit, we walked along a 50 meters, sorry, transect, and we collected all bees observed during 30 minutes. And we now have some preliminary results. And these data, I should also say that they include only wild bees, although we never saw many honeybees in these road verges. So we have species richness of the wild bees here to the left, and the abundance of the wild bees to the right. And these are the 5 most commonly visited plant species. And they're actually the same for both species richness and for abundance of bees. And they are in spring, it's Taraxacum, dandelion, and in summer it's 2 species of thistles. And then in late summer it's Jacobea, which is called ragwort in English, and this one is Hypocaris, which is called false dandelion. And in spring it was only Taraxacum, while in summer it was a much higher diversity of plants supporting these bees. But if we split the bees into the two large functional groups, solitary bees and bumblebees, a quite interesting pattern emerges. So for the bumblebees, which is the graph to the left, you can see that those plants which were most frequently visited were mostly yellow Asteraceae. You have Taraxacum, Hypocaris, Hieracium, and Tenacetum, in addition to these two other species. But on the other hand, bumblebees, which are the gray columns here, they very rarely visit these plant species. On the other hand, if we look at the bumblebees, then they visit a completely different range of plant species. So it's two species of Cirsium, and then you have this Jacobaea, Anthusa, Taraxacum, and Cnotia. And of these, it's actually only Taraxacum which is being quite often visited by solitary bees. So it seems that solitary bees and bumblebees actually split the flowers between them. Furthermore, at some site, it appears that different species of bumblebees have different preferences for flowers. So it appears that co-occurring bees, they share the floral resources by having different preferences, but we need to look a lot more into the data to find these more detailed patterns. So I would like to end this talk by acknowledging the large consortium involved in the Metacarpnet study. And in particular, I would like to thank the Norwegian Research Council for funding, which made this study possible. I would also like to thank Juliana for writing a very inspiring PhD thesis on these linear infrastructure habitats. And this broadened my view on road ridges and biodiversity in road ridges a lot. So thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Yoko. This was very great to listen to. Marcus, as you have mentioned sometimes in your presentation, is presenting also today, the last speaker of this webinar. So we will also hear something from him later today. I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A thus far. We do have some minutes left if anyone has some questions. Doesn't seem like it yet. I will give them a little bit time in case they're typing something right now. It is very, very interesting to see that the bumblebees and the solitary bees are so different when it comes to the flowers they're choosing. It was great to see that the dandelions are so popular, but when it comes to the bumblebees, it's not that popular. I think that is very interesting.
Of course, it also has to do with in spring, the bumblebee colonies haven't established yet, so that would be the queens. And in summer, you have much more individuals of bumblebees because you have all the workers. So that's, of course, part of the reason, but we were also quite surprised about this very clear patterns.
Yes, that's a very good point, of course. Yeah. There is one question here. Yoko, trying to find habitat for bumblebees on a topographical map. It's easy when you know where they sleep during the winter. You look for gentle slopes towards the south, where the early sun comes and melts the snow. Is it useful to have a map highlighting the slopes to the south to find bumblebee habitat? What other features we should look for in the landscape that we can spot from satellite photos?
Yeah, that might be of interest. Actually, we have seen in some studies that at least solitary bee richness is somehow related to soil types, which has to do with the nesting sites. So yes, definitely the location of overwintering sites and nesting sites are important.
I don't think I'm not sure if this is a comment to that, but isn't it that bumblebees has another configuration?
Oh, excuse me, I didn't understand the question.
No, I'm also struggling to understand if it is a comment to the question that was asked or if it was a comment to something we said earlier. Stefan, could you elaborate your question, if that's possible? Annika has a question meanwhile. I have heard that bumblebees go into slopes towards north for winter nests, so maybe they got in slopes both to the south and the north? I have also heard that bumblebees nest in the north. do they?
Oh, yes,
nest-
I think that they nest on northern slopes more than southern slopes.
Yes, because that is when.
Yeah,
the
yes,
snow
nests
is-
are mostly on southern slopes, but I think that overwintering is on northern slopes. And actually in forest floors, we don't know that much about overwintering in bumblebees.
Let's see. Someone is asking if it would be possible to read. Let's see the question. Just Daniel Ferrier's doctoral thesis online. Is it available?
I don't think
somewhere?
because it's not defended yet, so I'm sure that it's not online now. I don't know if the defense is public, I must admit.
Yes.
But I'm sure that you can, if you're interested, you can send me an email and I can send you the contacts for Juliana. Because I think that at least 3 of the papers are unpublished, so I'm quite sure that it's not publicly available.
Yes, those things usually take some time
Yes,
before
it
they're.
takes some time. Yes.
Okay, that was all we had time for as to the questions. So Jakob, will your presentation be available online later?
Yes, but I will probably remove the last few slides about the unpublished data.
Of course.
Yes, but I will be
So-
happy to discuss with anyone.
Great. And you will be in the webinar later on
I
today?
think I will be here most of the time.
Yes.
So
you
yes,
can ask.
please feel free also to send me an email. I think I
Great.
put my email actually on the first page. I can go back.
Yes. Great, because there are some more questions in the chat. It looks.
Okay, I can just go back to the first one. Yeah, here's my email.
Yes, so everyone write that down very quickly. Jakob, thank you so much for this presentation. And then we are moving on to the last speaker before lunch, which is Sandra Lindstem.
Yes.
Are you with us here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Oh,
Great.
oh.
And you are from the Swedish Board of Agriculture in Sweden, of course?
Yes, I've recently begun to work here as an analyst, working with biodiversity. But a month ago, I was working at Lund University, and I will tell you about the literature synthesis that I performed together with Professor Henrik Smith when I worked there at the Center for Environmental and Climate Science. And this literature synthesis was about competition on from honeybees on wild bees and the effects, the knowledge gaps and interventions. I will begin with a bit of background. Wild bee ranges are decreasing and many species populations are small or declining. And this is reflected in that 1/3 of Sweden's 299 wild bee species is on the red list. Many of these live in agricultural land. Some of the major threats against bees, as most of you probably are very well familiar with, is deteriorated and decreasing habitats, pathogens and parasites, pesticides and climate change. And the honeybee, which is only one species, share many problems with wild bees, but the honeybee gets help from beekeepers to tackle many of these problems. For example, finding nest sites, forage, and to handle pathogens. In return, we gain crop pollination, honey, knowledge, and engagement about bees. It's estimated that there are now 90 million honeybee hives in the world, a steep increase of about 83% since the 1960s. And this development is driven mainly by increases in Asia, but also in Sweden, as you can see here to the right, the last 20 years, the number of honeybee hives have increased by 60 to 70%. Sweden is located at the edge of the honeybees range, and it's unclear to what extent honeybees have been here and for how long, and where in the country they've been. In the northern part of our country, honeybees have most likely very short history. while historical documents refer to bee hunting in southern Sweden, which indicates that there's been wild bees or honeybees there. But since the honeybee hives the number of honeybee hives are increasing so much, there are concerns that competition from honeybees will increase the pressure on wild bees. And species of bees can affect each other in several ways. For example, by transmission of pathogens and by competition for resources such as nest sites and forage. Competition over resources is common, it's natural, and it occurs whenever organisms use the same resource and the resource is limited. And for bees, competition over nest sites is probably very, well, it's not an issue in Sweden because feral honeybees are, honeybees are lacking, or they quickly die when infested by varroa. The fact that honeybees probably have been present in southern Sweden for a very long time means that a niche separation between them and wild bees can be expected to have occurred and led to coexistence. But since honeybees is a species that is managed in human-dominated landscapes, the situation is not so simple. Honeybee management has improved. Honeybees are increasing. They are feeling better or managed better. And to this, many landscapes, mostly agricultural, has undergone vast changes with altered availability of resources, and this may affect competition. But wild bees and honeybees have a lot in common, and we need to have joint efforts to benefit all bees to gain a greater potential to be successful. But we still need to acknowledge the competition question. And this discussion about competition must be anchored in scientific findings, and it should always have coexistence as a target. And Lund University was commissioned by the Swedish Agricultural Board to review the scientific literature on competition between honeybees and wild bees for foraging resources. We systematically mapped the European empirical evidence on floral resource competition and wrote a report that is intended to contribute to this dialogue between authorities and beekeepers and nature conservationists. We searched the academic database IC Web of Science, and we identified 891 papers. After screening title and abstracts, we excluded 266 papers that wasn't relevant, and then we read the full texts of the remaining 609 papers. Among these, we found 57 relevant papers, 24 reviews, and 33 European empirical papers that in some way provided evidence of competition for floral resources. We found the resource competition between honeybees and wild bees can occur if they have overlapping food resources or food choices, which can have impact on what flowers they visit and their resource intake. But the long-term impact of competition on population depends on how reproduction and survival are affected. So we organized the papers that we found according to this model. We sorted studies based on whether they focus on overlapping resource utilization, impact on foraging and resource intake, realized niche, and reproductive success and survival. While the first of these boxes are effects of competition, or can show effects of competition, only long-term negative effects on the reproduction and survival will lead to effects on the long-term development of populations. So among these papers, we found 5 studies about floral resource overlap. and they showed that about 50% of the flowers that wild bees and honeybees visits are visited by both groups. For effects on foraging and resource intake, we found 8 studies. Honeybees can indeed be very effective and deplete the availability of pollen and nectar and alter the foraging behavior of wild bees. But sometimes bumblebees are shown to be the winner, for example, long-tongued bumblebees in deep flowers. The majority of wild bees are generalists and very flexible foragers, which means that they can change what flowers they visit when honeybees are present. And that effects are not necessarily translated into effects on reproduction and survival. We found 23 studies on effects on densities and diversity with very mixed effects. Several well-replicated experimental studies showed lower densities of or diversity of wild bees when honeybee densities were higher, while some correlative studies found positive correlations. But this can be caused by aggregation of bees, both honeybees and bumblebees in flower or solitary bees in flower-rich environments. Very few studies on were found on effects on reproduction and survival, only 6. Some of these showed no effect, while some showed negative effects. And we found no studies at all on survival, but this is indeed very difficult to examine. And overall, we note that many of the European studies are correlative, sometimes suffering from a lack of replication and even control areas. And we have only found a few well-replicated experimental European studies with control areas. And this means that the evidence base for competition is quite thin. So it's difficult to draw any definite general conclusions about long-term effects of honeybee keeping on wild bee populations and to what extent competition affects wild bees. But we conclude that the majority of the observational studies, as well as the well-replicated experimental studies whose evidence value is higher, clearly point to negative effects of honeybees on wild bees. And this result is largely in line with the literature reviews conducted with a global focus. We also looked for studies examining critical levels of honeybees, and we found a few of these. In studies with more than 3.5 honeybee hives per square kilometers, there were more often effects, and there were studies showing effects within 600 to 1100 meters distance from honeybee hives. But this is, of course, most likely dependent on the availability of flower resources in the area. We also checked for modifying factors and found a few studies that examined the modifying effects of landscape character, with the less pronounced effects in landscapes with more semi-natural habitats. But this there is much more to examine in this matter. So in Sweden, we have generally low densities of honeybee hives. We have in general 0.4 honeybee hives per square kilometers compared to the average European density, which is 4.2 honeybee hives per square kilometer. But 70%, about 70% of the Swedish honeybee hives is located in the southern part of Sweden, Götaland, where the honeybee density is just below the European mean. So the relatively low densities of honeybees in Sweden suggest that there that the general risk of major negative consequences of honeybee keeping on wild bees is small, but it is not known which densities of honeybees can be considered safe for wild bees or constitute an acceptable level of competition under different situations and in different environments, for example, in semi-natural pastures. And there are also a few species that are potentially more sensitive to competition from honeybees. We also looked for potential interventions to avoid or mitigate potential effects of honeybee competition. And we found none that were tested empirically, but several suggestions. For example, increase of floral resources or to adjust the distance to protected areas is another suggested intervention, or adjust densities or avoid honeybees in protected areas. It's also suggested to apply the precautionary principle in areas with threatened wild bee species or threatened wild bee species that has a high forage overlap with honeybees. There's also been developed a few tools in an attempt to illustrate and estimate an apiary's resource utilization compared to solitary bees' need for food to produce offspring. These authors, Kane and Tepedino, developed a measure called hive units monthly. And this corresponds to 33 offspring of the solitary leaf-cutting bee Megachile rotundata, which leads to that, for example, 40 honeybee hives in an apiary for 3 months can collect the equivalent amount of pollen as the need of 4 million of this solitary bee species. There are also parameterized models being developed, but these depend on data from empirical studies that I've already described has a bit thin evidence base. So there are some important knowledge gaps. We need more studies on reproduction and survival, and we need to study more species. There are often focus on bumblebees and a few solitary bees. We also need to look more on context-dependent effects. For example, honeybee distances and densities. We need to do dose response studies to identify critical levels of honeybees. And we need to do this in combination with different levels of floral resource availability, which most likely affects competition. But we also need to get more information about basic bee biology. What regulates bee populations and how important is competition in relation to other threats? So in summary, the evidence base is for competition is quite thin. It's therefore difficult to draw any definite general conclusions about long-term effects of honeybee keeping on wild bee populations. But the majority of the observational studies, as well as the well-replicated experimental studies, point to that there are competition going on, and that the honeybee is often the dominant competitor with the potential to have negative effects on wild bees. So it's very important to keep on working with this issue, both through focused research and by development of tools and interventions, so we can limit and mitigate potential negative effects and create conditions for coexistence and turn around the negative trends for wild bees. Yes, that was what I was planning to tell you today. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was great. I see there is one Q&A. Hi, Sandra. Thanks for a nice presentation. A couple of questions. We can start with the first one. Out of curiosity, how much time did you guys use to go through the papers you revised?
How much time? Well, I think it took maybe a month, a bit less maybe.
And the second question is there a written report or manuscript with all this information?
Yes, it's we have left it for publication, but it's not out yet. But it will be available, I think. I need to check that. But it will most probably be available at the Lund University homepage.
Great. I see some of the panelists, you are just asking questions to hosts and panelists. So if you could change that to everyone, I think it's easier for everyone to follow the questions. I see that Anna has published the bee campaign from earlier, but it's only going to, no, it's from everyone. Great. Are there any other questions before we head to lunch? We also in Landbrukshuset see the problem in there not being enough studies about the competition between wild bees and honeybees, and that causes some, well, disturbance between people managing bees and people working with conserving the wild bees. So it's great to see that people are encouraging more of these studies so we can actually have a definite answer if more managed bees is a problem for wild bees or if it's not as bad as we think it is. So hopefully there will be more studies in the future for this. But are there any last questions? Have you assessed the statistical power in the references?
We have tried to describe how each reference, the evidence value of each reference, depending on design and replication and so on.
Great. Okay. I think people are getting ready for a lunch break, and I understand I'm also getting a little bit hungry. Stella, thank you so much for your presentation, and your presentation will also be available online later.
Yes, in some form. Yes, I need to check it before.
Yeah, that's no problem. And will you be here at the webinar later in case someone suddenly have some more questions for you?
I will be available until 1 o'clock. Then I have to jump to another meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then I just gonna say that it's time for lunch. I'm suggesting that you don't leave the Zoom call just in case there will be any problems getting back in. So just stay in the Zoom call for us until we're back again. And I will see you soon at 12 o'clock, and have a great lunch, everyone.
I think I can't put it. Let me try to do this one. Oh, this. Maybe now I can see full screen.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm Mart Meriste. I'm biologist and actually graduated university as a zoologist, but life makes its turn. So I'm now doing mostly botany and mostly like this practical part of the botany and nature conservation. And one of the things we are doing in our company is producing native seeds. And as I know very well, it's not a very a new thing in Nordic countries, but it is quite new thing in Estonia and in other Baltic countries as well. So we have luckily quite a lot of semi-natural meadows still survived. It's of course a global problem that that those very species-rich communities are declining and seriously declining in the world everywhere. But luckily, we in Estonia have something like that to show to ourselves and our visitors. But of course, it's not everywhere like that. So the situation is probably as sad and as dramatic as in other parts of Europe. So this upper graph shows the area decline in recent about 100 years. So maybe about 5% of our total meadow areas is still preserved, but 95% of it we have lost. But compared to the many other parts of Europe, it's not that sad. It's very sad, but not that sad. So we have some meadow types which are quite well preserved, especially flooded meadows, for example. But to draw the problem or draw the map of the seeding or seed growing and using environment we have here, then this is good to see the map. So in Estonia, the most of the meadows still existing are concentrated in Western Estonia and in our bigger islands, where the agriculture intensity is low, and the areas where the agriculture intensity is high, for example, here in Central and Southern Estonia, there are very few meadows survived, and there are places where thousands or even 10,000s of hectares of agricultural land are basically without any semi-natural communities in between them. So this concentration of meadow areas is really good for conservation because of the bigger areas and good connectivity, but not so good for pollination services in agricultural landscape. And of course, Estonian nature conservation has very long tradition, and we have a lot to show in conservation part. So we have preserved quite a lot of our natural areas, but the restoration of degraded areas and creating nature-based landscapes are relatively new topic, and that's the thing we are doing in our company. And one of the biggest problem of drawing people's attention to the nature-based landscaping solution is that there is a general opinion that in Estonian nature actually it's all right, it's all well, and there's not much to improve. If we look the seed demand in Estonia or seed market, then before our activities there was basically non-existing market and non-existing demand. So we have sort of created it together with of course landscape architects, scientists, and conservation activists. But at the same time, the building activities or developing real estate activities in Estonia is really active. So there are basically a big potential to use this kind of landscaping solution. Growing, but maybe not as fast as it could be good for biodiversity. So there are some, or maybe I can even say quite a many of innovatively thinking landscape architects who are great partners for us. And also the private landowners, although they are less aware of native solutions, become more and more interested in this kind of things. In public areas, still, if you look at the public bigger development projects, the approach is still to prefer big lawn areas, of course, parking places and non-permeable cover. This is one of the building of Tartu University, sorry to say, but there's very little thinking has been done of biodiversity or native solutions in these open areas. And which is really sad. I can say that very low is the interest in these biodiversity options in agricultural sector. So Estonian agricultural sector is in general quite intensive and more like profit oriented than creating a nice landscape. But the awareness and demand increases year by year, so we are still quite optimistic. Our company is established in 2012, so next year we are celebrating our first bigger anniversary, and we are doing, of course, a lot more than just growing and selling seeds. And we are working under the concept of everyone's nature conservation, which basically means that everyone can be a nature conservationist, and conservation can be done everywhere. So our products are native meadow seeds, and we have been collecting them in several ways. And one of them is hand picking. Of course, we started by hand picking the seeds. Then we built some brush harvesting machines, and finally, now for years we are propagating the seeds in this agricultural manner. Machine collecting started in 2016 when we built our first machine. That is really maybe the best we could think, very universal machines that can be used in every type of the different meadows. And we have quite a lot of good collection sites, but there are some problems finding the sites. First, our criteria of sites are quite high, or the quality criteria are quite high. We need to find very nice and very diverse meadows in good conditions. And also maybe brush harvesting or machine collecting, the biggest problem is that these environmental schemes are not very good like company when collecting seeds, because usually those meadow areas are quite well maintained. They are mown before the seeds ripe, or there are pastures, so there's not so much seeds that these places are worth collecting. So the potential of machine collecting is hundreds of times higher than the actual places we have where to collect. Machine collected seeds are not so clean. They contain other plant debris, and they are really good to use in bigger areas, because most of the seeds are grasses. Then this flower beauty it's not so good. It's not so guaranteed, and we recommend to use the machine collecting seeds more in meadow restoration, more in replacing intensively managed agricultural lands with less intensively managed, like replacing fields with pastures, and more like, and of course in conservation works, because these are the real meadow seeds that are originated from real meadows. And this is the like driver's view of the seed collecting, and in the left you can see that seeds have been collected already. So that's the picture of machine collected seeds. And propagated seeds we started in 2017, and currently we grow 97 different plant species, and next year there are maybe like 20 species more. So we are growing all the time, and the sustaining of genetic diversity is done by constantly collecting seeds from the nature as well. So the plants we are growing ourselves are grown from the seeds that has been collected from the nature. We can make quite clean and quite high quality seeds and seed mixtures, and those seeds we recommend to use in meadow and garden areas to create meadows and garden areas in private and public green areas, and where the demand or the expectations of the flower richness is really high. So that's how our areas look like. And as this seminar is about pollination, we have done some observations, and we can conclude that it is the area where we produce our seeds is quite intensively agriculturally managed, but in our seed fields there seems to be no problem with pollinators, so we have plenty of them, and probably we are very important place locally to provide food for local pollinators. So we are helping sustaining the pollination service in this local area. So we like our seeds, we like them very much. They are really beautiful, and the seeds are as diverse as the plants themselves. So we are selling our seeds species by species if it's needed, or we can make very nice mixtures before we mix them. They are really colorful, and so that they can be used to create really beautiful meadow areas. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. We have some time for questions. And I see there are already some in the chat and the Q&A. Let's start with the chat this time. Matt, thank you for a very interesting presentation. The seed collector tool, is it a specially built machine, or is it available on the markets?
These machines are specially developed and built by us because when we started, we checked the market of those machines. There are quite a few producers, but it seemed to be that every machine is somehow adapted to the local conditions. So the producers in United States, they are more the machines are more optimized in their prairie habitats, and the producers in Australia, they are more like their grassy areas. And the first project we did with our machine was actually collecting seeds from the very low growing vegetation in calcareous grasslands, where we really needed the collecting height of 5 to 10 centimeters, and there was no machines available on the market. So we decided to develop the machine ourselves, and it succeeded. We succeeded very well. So we built another one. It's not available on the market, but we can make them. So.
What kind of land ownerships are the areas where you collect the seeds? Is it mostly private land, or is it difficult to form arrangements with the landowners?
Yeah, these are all private lands. It's not difficult, but usually there are not very many places where the landowner really don't want the hay or don't want forage or the pastures to use by themselves, because at the end of the summer, basically this biomass is not any more agriculturally valuable at all. So we have to find these kind of landowners who manage their land, so they are mowing their lands, but not planning of their animals. And there's not very much of those kind of farmers.
I see Annika is telling you, if you want more area to collect seeds, I would be interested in contributing to your activity. And she names Meadow in the chats. How do you handle the risk of harvesting and selling invasive species? Is that a problem?
Invasive species? We are not selling our harvest. You mean from these natural meadows? Yeah, there are some problematic species in some areas. Usually we avoid those areas totally, but as the machine is quite flexible, we can like stop the machine in every moment. We can raise it up when there's places, not so much invasive species, but there are some meadow areas where the species composition is not perfect for establishing new meadows. There can be some so-called so probably the actual content of problematic species in our seed mixtures are much lower than in meadows themselves. So we know plants, so we can recognize them before we collect the seeds from them.
Couple more questions. If you are in countries where not many natural species rich meadows are still existent, how do you think this does this reduced genetic diversity from seed collections affect adaptability of plants for restoration projects? How important is the local gene pool for successful seeding?
I can answer that question. I am actually working at the University of Tartu, and we have specifically, or our colleagues have also specifically looked at the impoverishment of genetic diversity in, for example, these seed growing areas in Central Europe. And if you are not careful, this can happen. So it's the natural process or natural selection quite quickly starts to steer genetic composition towards some species, and this is something that we have to take, and we take very seriously here, because the aim of these activities is conservation activities and improving the condition of nature. So as Mart said, it is actually very important to keep the continuous influx of new genetic material when you grow seeds, but also when you collect seeds and when you use them in the restoration. There has to be, and there are in every particular restoration project, one has to be very careful and set the standards where to collect the seeds for these particular restoration projects. They have to be nearby, and they have to cover, for example, if you collect seeds for restoration, they have to cover a number of different communities or kind of number of habitats nearby, that to ensure that you get this local genetic diversity into these restored areas. And this is and there is another question also regarding genetic diversity, and how do you ensure the genetic diversity when collecting seeds. That is also similarly the case. It has to be carefully monitored, the standardized approach, and I would say that there are not good standards across Europe. Well, they are not yet developed, and they should be developed, how to approach native populations and the seed collection in those, so that both the source populations won't suffer, but also the individuals, or kind of the material that you get from there, is genetically diverse. So as we are ourselves ecologists, we will follow these things very carefully, but I would also say that this would need pan-European standards, these kinds of approaches as well. That would be very, very good too, and necessary in coming years.
Great, thank you. We don't have much more time for questions, unfortunately, but there are some questions in the chat and the Q&A if you want to answer them as we move on into the webinar. Is your presentation going to be available online later?
Yes.
Yes,
of course.
good. And will you be continuing into the webinar with us and answering questions if people have them? Will you be staying in the webinar?
Yes. Till the end.
Great, thank you so much. We have to move on to the next presenter, Natushka Lee from Umeå University in Sweden, who are going to talk a little about pollen hunting. And there is the presentation. It is not in presenting mode.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm just trying to upload. Do you see anything?
Yes, we see the presentation, but also everything else in PowerPoint.
This is the page. So let me see. How is this one now? How about this one? No, I'm changing. I don't understand. Oops. So how about this? Is this fine?
No, it is great now.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so my name is Natushka, and I'm at the University of Umeå in northern Sweden. And since the last few years, I have been initiating projects around pollination protection management and research, since we have had very little efforts up here. Most of the activities are done in the south and middle of Sweden. But today I'm going to talk about another project here, which has more citizen science projects, and which is about pollen and bee pollen and hunting, how we can explore that. And I will explain that later on. It is actually a translation from a Swedish name, Pollenjakten. But let's first just look at the background, why we are doing this. And as we all know, I have to change the page here. So, as we all know, pollen and nectar are the main food sources for bees, managed bees as well as wild pollinators. And it's because pollen is the main protein source, while nectar is the main carbohydrate source. And they are very essential for the brood and other bee products like bee bread, which they feed on. And pollen analysis is actually quite important. We can do many things, and we can get a lot of interesting information out of that. For example, one thing is nutrient contents, and that again depends on the plant and the environment. And it is also a way to trace environmental hazards, pesticides, etc. And by looking at what kind of plants bees visit by pollen collection, we can get an estimation of the plant diversity. and if there's enough plants for all, and also, of course, for other science fields, paleosciences, forensics, etc. And then last but not least, of course, pollen analysis is very important in honey studies, because in that way we can trace the origin of the honey and if it's authentic, because honey is one of the most falsified food products today. So it's a very big business to have good pollen analysis of honey, among other things. And actually, many people may not pay much attention to the pollen. I think, yes, so what, pollen, the bees collect pollen. But if you look into that in more detail, you get such fascinating insights into what the bees are doing. Here are just two pictures showing how it varies for time at one place. To the left, you see the different dates. And on 7th June, there's nothing because it was rainy that day and the bees stayed inside. But you can see on the colors that it's changing. So the bee scouts, they're always constantly looking for new plants to forage on, and then they find them and then they could tell the others and then they go there, and so they can shift. And then to the right, that is from 3 different beehives standing closely to each other, but from different locations. They are flying different directions. So somehow the bees can communicate with each other and share the different the foraging fields, which is quite interesting. So as you can see from the different colors, we can get some information about from which plants they have been picking them from. But our current attempts to identify pollens is quite limited. I mean, there's a lot in English and also in German literature and other languages, and they have all their pros and cons. I like in particular this website from the Sheffield beekeepers, where you can click on a color and then you will get information, or it's from this plant and so on, depending on the season. And then we have the most advanced one, which is called PALDAT, where you can get all information about pollen, but they have almost no information about the pollen colors, which is important for the beekeepers and also for those who are interested in bumblebees and want to know which plants they have been foraging on. So we will miss that. And in Sweden, I just take that as an example, we have some different literatures which are all nice, but none of them are complete. There's always some part missing. Either is the amount of plants listed up, or we don't have information about the colors or the shape and so on. And so it's a very important topic that we have to investigate and explore further for better analysis. And also there's a lot of research going on here at different parts in Sweden, and we even have a little EU project called Interreg, and where we also include a lot of pollen analysis, in particular Göteborg University, etc., and then our own effort. And because there are so many difficulties with this, we have had the big luck to be able to collaborate with the Nobel Prize Museum, because they have a big citizen science project which involves collaboration with schools and researchers, so that we can really try to develop better tools. And how do we now identify then the pollen? Well, if you look at these pictures, we can very well see that the colors may denote which plant it is. But the problem is that different plant species can have similar pollen colors. So we need to microscope it. And that is where we have a problem, because it's not so easy to identify if there are in particular lots of different pollen types. And so far, most beekeepers have always been saying that, well, honeybees are, in contrast to many other pollinators, quite loyal to certain flower species. But we have seen that it doesn't have to be like that. A honeybee can visit at least 20 flowers or more, and then it's much more complex. And we would like to know very much, why is that so? Could it be so that in agriculture areas, the bees have less access to a wide diversity of plants, while in other more wild areas they can visit more plants? We don't know. We will have to see. So as a part of this work and as a preparation for this citizen science project, we also prepared a database which includes all plants for all pollinators in Sweden. Now this sounds actually, well, is this really needed? Well, in fact, yes, because the literature that we have in Sweden is focused either only on the insects or on the plants, but there's very little interaction between these two. So if I want to look up which insects pollinate a particular flower, I cannot find it. I can find it other way, but not that way. And anyway, so our database consists of about over 10,000 plants, but we found out that about less than 10% are listed having specific plant species versus specific insect species. So there's a big knowledge gap. There are many plants as well as insects where we don't know who is pollinating what and when. And also we have a problem, we don't really know the exact amount of pollinating species in Sweden. I mean, our database says something between 1,500, 2,000, but others claim 3,000, but we don't know on what grounds. I have been discussing with many people. So we have a lot of knowledge gaps. And so you can see here, this picture may be a little bit confusing, but I hope not too much. But the different circles tell how many plants the different pollinator groups can visit. So you see actually the honeybees are topping because they have so far been able, we have described that they visit almost 460 different plants, while bumblebees with 137 plants, etc. So, and thanks to this database, we can do lots of fantastic systematic comparisons and also identify easily new kinds of research or inventory projects. So now I have, for example, students who are inventorying which insect is pollinating a particular plant species or vice versa, because we don't know. So here's fantastic database for lots of new innovative projects. And here's just one example. The blueberry, everybody knows that, but how many of you know how many insects pollinate blueberry? What would you say, 5, 10, or whatever? I'm not quite sure if anybody knows that until you look it up in this database, and then we find out, well, it's at least 30 different insects. And then, since I've been spreading this sheet to lots of colleagues and friends, people have started to check if this is true. And then suddenly somebody say, hey, I found another new species who also pollinates blueberry, likely. So here, it's a lot of research potential. But let's now look at the bees, what plants they are really visiting and what do we know about them. Well, as I said before, they forage on about 460 plant species, but we only know the polymorphology for about 100 plant species and the color for about 110. So there's actually limited possibilities to make proper pollen analysis. So we really need to develop better things. And that is why I'm coming back to this citizen science project, because this is almost impossible for a single small research group or a few research groups to cover all. We need a big national-wide exploration project. So this is it. It's called pollen hunting or pollen jakten. And as I said before that, it's a collaboration between researchers, students, schools, and beekeepers. And here our goals are, we really want to see and compare which plants do honeybees visit in different parts of Sweden, because Sweden is a long country with different kinds of landscapes. And what implications does this have on wild pollinators? And of course, then the next one is then we want to really do a systematic documentation of the pollen data. We want to produce an updated bee pollen herbarium, and we also want to establish a pollen honey database, including artificial intelligence, etc. And then, of course, last but not least, increase the public awareness and engagement in this. And these are the participants. So we have about 75 beekeepers and over 120 beehives participating, and this is expanding all the times because I get emails, I want to participate, etc. So this is fantastic. And we try to include all bee species that we have in Sweden, managed bee species. And we actually, for pedagogic reasons, we name each beehive after a Nobel Prize winner, because this forces the school pupils to think about, oh, who was this Nobel Prize winner? So we have a lot of win-win situations here. And we use a special pollen trap, which you can put under the beehive to collect it. And then each beekeeper has been allowed to choose their own harvest period. So some have been very ambitious and really collecting daily throughout the whole summers, and other pulled it and made it over periods, etc. But anyway, everything is equally interesting, and we will also follow this up next year. And this is how it looks like. We were drowning in parcels and pollen, but it was so exciting to look at it. And if you look at the picture there, this is just from one example this summer. And this beekeeper wanted to call his beehive after Typhoon Frisch, who studied honeybee behavior. And so, yeah. And so this is, and also we had lots of honey we were looking at, etc. So it was really, we were drowning of work, but it was fantastic. So now all this work is now at schools, and we have lots of schools participating here, and so far over 1,000 pupils are participating in this. And what are they doing? Well, they are first sorting and counting these pollen aggregates, and then go to perform simple mathematical and statistical calculations. So we know in this beehive, they collected 10% yellow pollen bees, but 80% something else, and so on. So we can then see how that varies throughout Sweden. And then they will also learn how to microscope and to describe very, very simple morphologies. Of course, we cannot expect professional analysis, but it's the first place start, and it's very fun for the students. They love to microscope this. And then they're going to try to identify the plants, and we have for this created some simplified pollen identification manuals, which I will talk about later. And then they will then present all the results as scientific posters, and there will be a school competition, and they will get prizes, etc. And then we have also constructed a lot of tutorial material, which is all in Swedish, unfortunately, but we are thinking about translating also into English. And there you can get, information about the background, and there are lots of tables, and we have instruction manuals, we have a pollen color map, etc. Access to the Swedish the databases of the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, etc. And also for every teacher who is participating, we have made a very nice gift package with lots of pedagogic stuff and books and information about both local pollination activities as well as national pollination activities. For example, Pollinate Sweden and the natural protection, I don't know what it's called in English, Naturvårdsverket, etc. And they also, last but not least, they got chocolate with pollen. If you didn't know, you should try. It's quite delicious and exotic. So this is how it looks like. I just visited a school this week, and this is how they are working it. And they really love it. They are so high-tech. They use mobiles to take pictures from the microscopes and fill in data in tables, etc. And this is the pollen color map we have made. It consists of 220 different colors. And those in the middle are the ones that have been published, at least in Swedish, Norwegian literature. But we really know which color corresponds to which plant. And then the colors outside are just arbitrary colors, just to be able to cover the whole color spectrum. So the students will now sort every pollen bead after these colors, and then tell, they are 20% of number 95 and 10% of number 117, etc. And so we will know at least how that varies, and we can make nice statistics for Sweden just because of that. Then the next step will then be to try to identify the plants. And here, there is no good literature, and it's actually a pain in the ass to identify pollen, but we try to make it simple. We simplified a lot of steps, and then we put all the colors that are known together with pictures of all the pollen that is also known. So we have here a manual with about 260 plant genera. So everybody, even beekeepers, can try to use it now. Now this is now in a very rough format. One day I hope we can prepare a proper bee pollen manual out of this. After we have finished this study, then we will have so much good background for this to making really an updated version. And then what are we then doing? It's not just what the schools are doing, but in the end, we will use some of this data to then be able to decide what to do next, and then really include more professional analysis. So we will include, for example, molecular studies based on DNA metabarcoding and be able to set up theoretical pollination networks. We will also try to develop faster detection methods because DNA barcoding and microscopy still takes a lot of time. And we are thinking about checking how the spectroscopy can speed this up a lot. And of course, we will also study nutrient status in pollen and also microbiome because we can find both bad as well as beneficial microbes in these and how they may affect the health of bees as well as humans when they eat it. Yeah, so those are our visions. So I think I'm done. And this is just my acknowledgement for everybody who participated. We have a long list of people who want to join us and lots of students want to work with this. So it's really been fantastic fun. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Natushka. This is great. I didn't know pollen could be that blue, so that was very interesting to see. There are some questions and we have some time for some of them.
Yes.
The first one is there research on multispectral differences between pollens to be able to differentiate more definite on color?
I was referring to one of them. You get it, it's very easily done. You just scan a spectrum of it. And there are researchers both in Norway as well as in other parts of Sweden. We are setting this up now also in Sweden. So yes, it is. So I actually believe you need to set up a database, of course, to have a reference database, but it would be a way because microscopy is still quite difficult and you really need to have a good microscope and not everybody can afford an electron microscope, etc.
Great. And Sandra is asking, hey Natasha, are you planning to publish your database?
Yes, of course. Actually, we are both thinking about making peer review articles because there's so much to do. It's more difficult to choose what do we start with. And then, of course, I'm trying to find publishers who want to publish this as a in Sweden we have these Floral books and so on, so everybody can look it up like a dictionary. And actually, I'm also finding somebody who wants to host this as an online database. Because I think this is knowledge that everybody should have, and it should not be. It should be for free. But somebody has to pay for the website and for hosting it and setting it up. It all takes time. But yes, this is why we are doing it.
And one last question: is there a risk that the number of species pollinated by honeybees are overestimated because it's easier to collect pollen from honeybees?
Yeah,
I find it strange.
Of course, but what we were thinking of is that by looking at, because we have this database, we will then also be able to see once we know which plants the bees have been visited, we can then indirectly then guess, but this plant could as well.
Anders? You are not on mute.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, so I just want to say, so once we know which plants the bees visit, and when we then know how many pollinators can visit a specific plant, we can then indirectly extrapolate about possible competition scenarios. So of course, it would be better to do. I myself think it's better to, of course, explore the pollinators in nature and really do inventory studies. But this is not something you can put on school children. We needed to think out a simple task for school children. So this was the way we took.
Yes, thank you so much. I think there are some few questions left in the chat. Are you going to stay here on the webinar so you can answer them? And also, will your presentation be available online after?
Yes, of course.
Yes, thank you so much. We need to get going to the next speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natushka. And next up is Ellen Svalheim from Neabiu, who are going to talk about collecting seeds for flower meadows. So if you can stop sharing your screen, Natushka. And then Ellen, you can start sharing yours.
Yes, hello. Is it okay now?
It's not up yet. It's when you click on the share screen and then choose the PowerPoint in the share screen.
Yeah. Just one moment. I find it. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you, La Suse. It's very interesting, this seminar, and it's lovely to see all the lectures. Very interesting. My name is Ellen Svalheim, and I'm a botanist, biologist, and work as a researcher at NIBIO, at the Department of Cultural Landscape and Biodiversity. My main subject area is endangered culturally dependent biodiversity. Today, I will present Frøboka, the Seedbook, a handbook for collecting local seeds for interest-friendly flowering meadows. But first, I want to tell you about the big role models for the flowering meadows that we want to get more of. I want to tell about the status of the hay fields in Norway. I also want to tell you about the background for the Seedbook, which has its origin in the advisory service for flowering meadows and the production of wildflower seeds that we conduct at NIBIO Landvik. First, an introduction to the really valuable flower meadows, the hay meadows. The species-rich hay fields in Norway received their own action plan in 2009. And since 2009, I have worked as a national coordinator for follow-up the action plan on behalf of the Norwegian Environmental Agency. Species-rich hay meadows are listed as critically endangered habitat types in the Norwegian Red List of 2018. In addition, the habitat type has got the status of a selected habitat type with a certain protection through the Biodiversity Act. And the landowners of these meadows can apply for support for restoration and annual mowing and care. They can apply for grants from both the environmental and the agricultural administrations. To the right is an overview of the number of meadows that received support from the environmental administration in the period of 2009 and to 2019. In 2021, we estimate that we have around 1,000 hay meadows under follow-up with both agricultural and environmental funds in Norway. These meadows are spread all over the country. The follow-up of the action plan has been a success, with many interested people and more meadows under management. Despite this, these important and species-rich biotopes constitute only small areas. In total, we have about 800 hectares of hay fields managed through the action plan in Norway by now. So what have we mapped of hay fields? According to Naturbase, which is the Norwegian Environmental Agency's database for endangered and valuable nature, about 3,950 hayfields with a total area of 4,000 hectares have been mapped. Of these, about 3,000 hectares fulfill the requirements for the selected habitat type through the Biodiversity Act, which means that at present we have about 1/4 of the mapped area with hay meadows under follow-up in Norway. But much remains to be mapped, so we expect the number of hayfields to rise. This winter, we are working on revising the action plan for hayfields. It's a goal that all hayfields with high and medium value shall be managed in the next period, 2002 to 2035. These two photos were taken in the 1920s and 1930s in Setesdal, a valley in Agder County in the southernmost part of Norway. Based on the statistics Norway's agricultural census, we know that the area with hayfields under management today constitutes 0.2% of the hay meadows that were mowed 100 years ago. In Norway, very large areas with semi-natural vegetation were mowed in both infields and outfields to be used as winter fodder. For example, in Valle municipality in Setesdal, where these two photos were taken, the outfield mowing area in 1907 was about 4,000 hectares, which is the same area we have mapped totally in the whole country per 2021. This is 6 times as large as the area which is now managed through the action plan. Through the action plan and the cultural landscape management in general, we have in recent years focused on the intermediate areas. We have gained an increased focus on landscape ecology and connectivity. How can the open landscape be arranged for more flower-rich areas, which, for example, can be good support habitats around the hayfields or other species-rich habitats in the cultural landscape, or act as important stepping stones to bind habitats together? To establish new and restore existing flower meadows, seeds of native wildflowers are needed. We need both professional seed production of larger quantities, and we also need people who are able to collect local seeds themselves. At Nibio Landvik, where I have my office and where I work, it's nearby Grimstad in southern Norway, we established the Norwegian Center of Competence for Flowering Meadows and Wild Seeds in 2018 as a part of the project From Grassland to Flowering Meadows. Top left, you can see my colleague, the leader of this project, and the leader of flower seed production at Landvik, Trygve Åmli. In 2016, we started to collect and multiply native seeds of wildflowers. Nibio Landvik has extensive experience with seed production. Ever since its establishment in 1950, the research center has been a leading player in research on the propagation of and use of grass seeds, clover seeds, vegetable seeds, and seeds of wildflowers. We have divided Norway into 9 regions and now produce regional native seeds mixtures for each region, based on original mother seeds collected in the regions. Since 2019, we have had seed mixtures for dry meadows and wetter meadows in the southeast region of Norway for sale. To the left, you can see the composition of the dry meadow mixture for the southeast this year. It contained 24 different species. We also had a seed mixture for central Norway for sale this year with 10 species. The next year, this mixture will contain more species. In the spring of 2002, regional seed mixtures will also be launched for 4 or 5 more regions. And by 2024, we will have seed mixtures for all regions for sale. In 2021, we produced seeds from 70 semi-natural species. In addition, to the seed production that we carry out on our own area at Niby og Landvik, almost 30 contract seed growers also produce seeds for us. The seed mixtures are quality assured by me and other regional botanists and insects researchers and are becoming increasingly species rich. The seed production at Niby og Landvik is an ongoing process. Since we haven't had seed mixtures for all regions ready for sale yet, we have encouraged people to collect seeds themselves. And we also think if many people collect seeds locally, it will help to take care of the genetic variation of the species. To motivate local seed harvesting, and to help all those interested, the idea came to make Frøboka, the seed book, a handbook to collecting local seeds for flower meadows. The seed book gives advice and inspiration on where and how to collect seeds of wildflowers. It tells when the different plants bloom and set seeds. The book also gives advice on different methods for establishing flower meadows or how to restore meadows in decay. Anyone who knows what this is? It's a very known plant, very well-known plant. It's bluebell, blåklokke, Campanula rotundifolia. Many people know the plants when they bloom, but fewer know what the plants look like when they are withered and have mature seeds. With help of detailed photos, we make it easier to recognize the plants in different stages of development, what they look like when they have withered and have mature seeds. What the seeds look like and how they can be harvested and dried. This shows the bluebell seeds. In addition, we focus on the anatomy of the flowers, when the different plants bloom and set seeds, how they spread the seeds, and which insects pollinate them. This is flekkrisøre in Norwegian. It's spotted cat's ear, Hypocheris maculata, from bud to flower head with mature seeds. The seeds of Hypocheris maculata. Here it's a ragged robin, eller hanekam in Norwegian, Lichnis floskukeli, which grows in moist meadows. And the seeds of ragged robin is beautiful pictures. We have a very good photographer at Nibio Landvik. His name is Ove Hetland, and he has taken fantastic pictures. The book also tells about the most common forms of seed dispersal. For example, with wind, or for example, with animals. The book presents about 50 different wildflowers that grow in native hay meadows and that play an important role for all the insects that pollinate them. Many of the wildflowers we describe are found throughout the country. In addition, we have included lists of supplementary species for each region. We also give an introduction to the various traditional cultural fields and our most important pollinator groups, and why this diversity is now threatened and what we can do to maintain it. So here you can see all of us. The Seedbook has been created by us at Nibio through a collaboration between 9 researchers and engineers at various departments and divisions. And it's my department of Cultural Landscape and Biodiversity that has led the work. And I also have to tell the Seedbook is supported by Sparebankstiftelsen, the Norwegian Directorate of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. And it's published by Fagbokforlaget. So yes, that was what I had. And if you have questions, you can ask me.
Yes, thank you so much, Ellen. It's great to hear about this, and it's been very fun to see how popular the seeds have become over the years. There seems to be some questions. There was someone asking if frøboka can be bought in Sweden.
It can be ordered through the Fagbokforlaget or by you at La Humlashuset.
That's true.
Yes, but yes, so you can order it through the internet.
Yes. And someone are asking, are the seeds available to the public to buy for their own little flekker?
I didn't understand. What did you say?
If the seeds are available to purchase for the public.
Yes, yes. You can buy it at the shops Felleskjøpet in Norway. And if it's quantities larger than 100 grams, you can order it directly from us at Nibio Landvik. Yeah.
And also in our store, lahumlashuset.no, you can also find the seeds there. Marcus, I have a question. Fantastic effort and great to hear that several regional mixes are underway. Quick question, are all seed mixes produced in the same place? And if so, do you avoid cross-pollination between flowers from the same species, but from different regions?
We have quite many of the species are produced at Landvik, but we have placed different flowers from the different regions in a distance from each other, and we are thinking that this should make it not possible in so big way to cross-pollinate. But we also have these contract seed growers for us, 30 different contract seed growers, and then they will be isolated in a better way. And we have also a goal that the regional seeds should be produced in the region. Until now, we have quite many contract seed growers that are around us in Grimstad region, Agder County, but increasingly we want to have more contract seed growers in the other parts of Norway.
I think that's all the time we have for now, but there are some more questions in the chat and also a Q&A. So if you have time to answer them during the rest of the webinar, that would be great. Will your presentation be available online afterwards?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. We're moving on to our next speaker who made it just in time. Anders Nilsen, also from NIBIO, is going to talk about sublethal effects of neonicotinoids under different climate conditions. Are you with us, Anders?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I just arrived here at Uppsala 15 minutes ago. Plane was delayed.
Perfect timing.
These things, yes. I will try to share my screen. Can you see something?
Yes.
No.
Yes, perfect.
This is the right version, you can see?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, La Humla Suse, for inviting me to talk a bit at your seminar. And thank you to Ellen as well for the good commercial for the Seedbook. Ellen and I are working at the same department at NIBIO, so we are colleagues. But this work that I will present now is based or stemming from a project I'm leading at the University of Oslo, where I used to work before. There I work together with Professor Katrine Borgå at the ecotoxicology section. And the work that has been done on this project has mainly been done by students. Julie Sørli Paus Knudsen is currently a PhD student on the project. And Pavel Kolano and Malin Årønes have previously done their masters on the project. So I will refer to them as the real researchers. I'm only the manager here. So first of all, plant protectant products are heavily used in agriculture. That's something we know quite a bit about. So this is just a graph I made earlier this week based on some numbers I found at Eurostat. And you can see the gray part of the cake here is insecticides. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of the amount sold in Europe in 2019 was insecticides. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Yes. And this is just, again, from Eurostat, some crude measures on how much is traded from year to year. And you can see the gray line, which is, again, the insecticides. It is constantly, at least slightly increasing. So pesticides like this is nothing that is kind of being taken off the market and being reduced. It's a constant pressure on ecosystems from these substances. Out of these insecticides, the neonicotinoids, it's a bit difficult to find the exact numbers, but at least a few years back, 1/3 roughly of the insecticides sold was neonicotinoids. And these pesticides are systemic, which means that you don't need to spray them on crops. You can actually treat the seeds with them, and then the entire plant get toxic to insects. Which was, of course, a big advantage. And when these substances first arrived, of course, you can reduce the amount of pesticide you use and also the spillover to adjacent areas, and wild ecosystems is supposedly smaller. But of course, we have seen that it's not that easy. This is just also a sketch about the mode of action of these pesticides. They affect the nerval transmissions in insect invertebrates in particular. They are not really dangerous to mammals. That's also a benefit from these pesticides. And what's happening is basically that the nerves start firing constantly and causes paralysis that ultimately makes the insects die. But what we are looking at is everything that happens before the insects die. Because studies have shown that these pesticides accumulate in insect brains long before they cause mortality. In the brain, they actually are ending up in the mushroom bodies, which are parts of the insect brain that is related to learning and memory. So we hypothesize that even really low exposure levels to neonicotinoids would potentially affect behavioral aspects of the insects, which again might have effects on their population dynamics, survival, and what's not. You might have heard that a few of these neonicotinoids are now banned in Europe. This was a long process. It's also worth mentioning that new neonicotinoids are constantly being designed. Only a few of them are available on the European market, but in other parts of the world with less regulations, there's a lot of these substances being used. So in 2013, based on concern from NGOs and researchers, there was a temporary ban of these 3 neonicotinoids. In 2015, there was a second evaluation that was initiated and the conclusion was planned in 2017. The EU received so many inputs from the industry, from researchers, and from others that they spent a bit extra time. But as of 2018, these 3 active ingredients are banned in the EU. However, in the ban, there is something called Article 53, which relates to emergency derogation. That is, if in a country they see no other option than using these pesticides, they can ask for an exception. And this is happening a lot. And some countries are worse than others. But this is definitely an issue, and these substances are indeed still in use. I think it is next year that also thiacloprid will be banned, which affect Norwegian fruit producers because they use a pesticide called a product called Calypso, which contain this active ingredient. But that will be in effect from next year, I think. So what are we doing in Neopol? We are looking into how clothianidin, which is banned in Europe, but still used in Europe, and it's heavily used in the rest of the world. And we are trying to figure out how it accumulates in bumblebees. We are trying to assess sublethal effects. That is what is happening with the bumblebees we are studying before they die. In particular, we are looking at behavioral changes, which relates to movement, foraging, food storage, and hive development. And we do this by chemistry, chemical analysis of bumblebees exposed to clothianidin. We have done some lab experiments in the flight arena, and we have also done natural experiments out in the field to see how the clothianidin is affecting behavior in more real settings. So first, the chemistry. This is Malin. She did her master's with us at the Neopol project. And these are just some results from that master thesis that is published. You can see the reference at the bottom of the page. And as you can see in the workers with medium and high exposure, we could detect clothianidin in the worker's head and in the body. And the same we could in the queen. but then only in the body. We didn't have enough queens to make enough substrate to analyze on. It's also important here to note that the low, medium, and high exposure levels are all within what we called field realistic doses. That is what a bumblebee could expect to be exposed to by foraging, for instance, in an oilseed rape field where the seeds have been treated with clotianidin. So we are not giving them extreme doses just to see if they die. This is Julia, some preliminary data from her master thesis. She's now on a PhD program on this project. And Julia made this flying arena that you can see to the left, a sketch of it to the right, where we placed yellow and blue artificial flowers. And we're trying to figure out whether the bumblebees were able to learn which color contained sugar in or what colors contained only water. So that's more detailed into the learning process. To do this, there was a bit of technical issues. We put up cameras. So this is just a picture of the output from the cameras. As we are using two, we can get pictures in 3 dimensions, so we can follow the movements both up and right and left, yeah, in all dimensions. So we can actually follow each bumblebee very detailed and how it's moving around within the flying arena. And then we, of course, can assess how many right flowers and wrong flowers and how much time they spend doing completely different things. So let's see if I can get this moving. Can you see the flight paths of the bumblebees? Irene, could you?
Yes, we can see them.
Yeah. So this is the kind of data we get, and based on this, we can automate the analysis to actually by a computer assess how many right flowers, how many wrong flowers, and all these things that are being visited. So these are just some preliminary results based on these flight arena video recordings. To the left here, you can see the green lines are the control bumblebees, and if the line is towards the bottom and the right of the graph, they move faster. The yellow is low dose, the red is high dose, and the black is even higher dose. So as you can see, based on this, we have shown that the bumblebees are really moving slower as they are exposed to pesticides. We also found that the proportion of rewarding flowers visited was lower at the high dose. The high dose in this case is an extremely high dose. 100 micrograms per liter is supposed to be close to lethal. So here we are kind of pushing the limit. And we also found that the bumblebees exposed to higher doses consumed less nectar. Again, something that has to do with behavior. Finally, we did what I would call a natural experiment, where we were trying to figure out if bumblebees exposed to clotianidin spend longer time out foraging. And this is the setup that Pavel, the master student doing this project, made. And you can see 3 bumblebee hives. This is the hive, and then there's an entrance box. And these were all, in these entrance boxes, we had cameras. This is inside the entrance box. The camera is up here, and there's an entrance and an exit. And all the bumblebees received a type of QR code on their neck. So we could register when they left the hive and when they returned. So this was actually enabling us to follow individual workers, how many times they went out foraging and how much time they spent when they were out. Which again, then of course, spending more time foraging is not necessarily good, since then you're not able to bring as much food back to the hive. In the end, we registered 4,000 foraging bouts. And again, we had controlled bumblebees, and we had bumblebees exposed to low and high dose of clothianidin. And this study, again, is within what we call field realistic doses. So what we found was that the number of foraging bouts were, of course, mostly during the day, but there was no difference in kind of diurnal patterns between the control and the two exposure levels. The foraging bout length throughout the day was also not affected, it was pretty much the same. However, what we found was that the temperature affected the foraging bout length, but the effect was only seen for the bumblebees exposed to clothianidin. The controlled bumblebees spent pretty much the same time on a foraging bout, whether it was 10 or 28 degrees, while the low and high doses spent much more time on each foraging bout at low temperatures than they did at high temperatures, which shows us that exposure to pesticides is context dependent, and it is really important to take into account the climate conditions under which the bumblebees are living when you are doing risk assessments and trying to figure out the negative effects of these pesticides. Just to sum up, pesticides, even neonicotinoids, are still heavily used. We have shown that they pose threats to important pollinators, that is bumblebees, at sublethal exposure levels, even within what we called field realistic doses. We have also shown that climate conditions interact with exposure, that the climate the bumblebees are experiencing will affect the effect of the pesticide. And we suggest that in the future, risk assessments should include also climate conditions. Currently, Norway is not doing risk assessments of pesticide. It's all done by EFSA in the EU. Maybe that's not such a good idea because things might be different up here in the north. And the papers based stemming from the master thesis I have presented are found at the bottom. And with this, I just say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anders.
Thank you.
Have a little time for some questions, and I think there are some in the Q&A. The first one is, in which plants are these pesticides used?
I know they're used on oilseed rape in particular. Also in apple orchards in Norway, they use Calypso thiometoxam, is that the name? Yeah, which is sprayed only during night, but they are used on a lot of things. Definitely.
But how do you know if a plant or a fruit is affected with neonicotinoids?
You don't.
Oh.
You have to ask the farmer.
Exactly, and trust them, they're being truthful.
Yeah. The Food Safety Authority, of course, is doing a lot of testing of imported fruits and vegetables and look for this in particular. So we are pretty safe in Norway, but you can never guarantee anything. And of course, when they do the spraying in Norway, they do that in the flowering stage in apple orchards, which is long before the fruit start produce at all. So I don't think I would be too worried about that.
Good. Can bees recover of nicotinoid or nicotine, or is it nicotinoids treatment?
Neonicotinoids, yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. I think after a while the pesticide will get out of the body, but I'm not sure anyone have studied that in particular. It's a good question.
Is there a last question we can have time for before we have to move on? I think it is very shocking that there is not being more research done on these types of pesticides before they're actually used. I hope that in the future we're being more careful with these pesticides. Someone just, are these used in eco-friendly food?
What was the question?
Do you know if the pesticides are used in eco-friendly food?
I have no idea. What is eco-friendly food?
I think it's more like organic farming. Are they using these pesticides?
No, I don't think it's eco. No, I don't think they are allowed to use any pesticide.
And someone just commenting, actually Norwegian authorities assess the formulations like Calypso, but not the active ingredients, which is done by member states of EFSA. Yep. Okay, great. That was the time we had. Thank you so much, Anders, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Will your presentation be available online later? Is it okay if we make it available?
That's fine.
Great. Will you be staying in case someone has some questions later in the chat?
I will stay for a while, yes. I can follow the chat. It's great. Marcus is the last presenter, is that true? How long is this planning to last?
No longer than 2 o'clock.
Okay, then I'll be around.
Yes. Great, thank you so much. And that also gives the introduction to our last presenter, who has been mentioned sometimes at this webinar, Marcus Sydenham from Nina in Norway. Can you hear us? Yes, there you are.
I hear you fine, thanks.
You're having a presentation on wild bee flower preferences and their implications for bee conservations.
Yes, I can share my screen here. And that should get you on. Are you on presenter mode now?
It looks like we have the side slides as well. I think you can change them in the display settings.
Let's see. Yeah, let's see. There you go. Is that better?
It's the same here where we see the entire PowerPoint.
Let's see. Try again.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Sorry about that. So my name is Marcus, and I work I study wild bee ecology and conservation at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. And I work together with Anders, who just presented from Nibio, and also with Yoko from Aarhus University in Denmark, and with people from Copenhagen University, Oslo University, and the Norwegian University of Life Sciences on a shared project. But now my talk now is going to be about wild bees and flowers and the preferences of wild bee to flowers of wild bees and the implications for conservation. Let me find the right screen here. There you go. So as Anna said earlier today, we know that bees have specific preferences for different flowers. For example, the bee in the picture here, Desupporta hirchipes, or buksebee in Norwegian, exclusively collects pollen from yellow asters, as seen here in the picture. So in order to conserve bee diversity, we need to make sure that, for example, seed mixes contain the right amount of different types of plants in order to sustain viable populations of bees. We've already heard about these seed mixes. We've heard about floral preferences and that they differ between species, also by Yoko. So I thought I would take you on a short trip back in time to talk a bit about the different mechanisms behind these floral preferences and how they evolved. So bees mainly visit eudicots or angiosperms, flowering plants. Angiosperms evolved from gymnosperms, where you have pine trees and so on, about 130 million years ago in the Cretaceous period. Now, this time period is a time where the climate was cooling. You see from the images on the left-hand side of the screen that what is now Africa and South America was joined together in one large continent. So this is where the angiosperms evolved, or during this time period. Now, at the same time that the angiosperms evolved, or the flowering plants evolved, we also see an enormous diversification in insects, and mainly in lepidopterans, so butterflies, and in flies, but also in Hymenoptera, or wasps. So the Cretaceous period is a period where we see a lot of diversification within insects for which many of them pollinate plants and depend on plants for foraging. But we also see a massive diversification and radiation of flowering plant diversity. If we zoom in on the wasp clade or Hymenoptera clades, we also see that the bees evolved during this time period. They evolved during the time of while the eudicots evolved about 125 million years ago. And bees, let's see. Now, the current hypothesis is that bees evolved from a Svecid wasp, which is a predatory wasp, that foraged on thrips or thrips that eats pollen. So a wasp that hunted pollen collecting thrips would bring back pollen back to its nest, and over time there would have been a selection for individuals individuals within that wasp species that collected more and more pollen, and eventually you got something that resembled a bee. So that's sort of the idea of the transition from a predatory lifestyle within wasps to a pollen collecting lifestyle within bees. Now, I have to say, I love the title of this paper by Cardinal and Danforth, The Age of the Eudicots. It reminds me of the song Age of Aquarius from the Hair musical. I don't know if any of you have seen that. My parents brought me to see it when I was a kid. And the musical Hair is about a time period in the 60s and 70s, which to a large extent was about sexual revolution and freeing of sex, and well, basically making sex a private matter and not something that other people should decide what should be like. So a sexual revolution. The same is very much the case in the Cretaceous period, where you see the gymnosperms, which are mainly wind pollinated, being transferred or translocated or outcompeted by angiosperms that suddenly become a lot more dominant. Now, angiosperms and the transition from wind pollination to animal pollination meant that the pollen economy suddenly came much more into play. If you're a wind pollinated gymnosperm, for example, you need to produce a hell of a lot of pollen and also have quite a lot of receptors or ovules and landing platforms for this pollen in order to make sure that you're pollinated. If you can direct your pollen and somehow make sure that your pollen gets collected by the best pollinator, then you should ideally be able to reduce the costs of reproduction. So you would think that there would be a selection towards a more efficient pollination system, which we see in some plants, in figs, for example, and yucca trees. Now, plants can evolve to pollinators and to attract the correct pollinators in many different ways. One way, for example, is to evolve deep nectar spurs, as seen in this plant, Lindtorskemon, it's called in Norwegian. I'm sorry, I don't have the Latin name. and where you see a Bombus hortorum that has a long tongue, so that the floral rewards from that plant is sort of attempted to be kept for the correct pollinator. Another way, however, is also that plants could deceive or trick bees. Now, when bees or other pollinators visit flowers, they do it to get a resource. They don't do it to be kind. This is not a love relationship. They do it to either get nectar or pollen, or maybe hairs or other plant materials that they need for their reproduction or energy. Plants, on the other hand, they want to reduce the cost of the pollination. They don't want to waste pollen on insects that don't, well, they basically don't want to lose pollen out of their reproductive cycle. So some plants like the Ophrys or lilies have evolved what we call shelter mimicry syndrome, where the flower looks like it's a cave that the bee can dive into and hide away from the heat of the sun. Then when it dives into this, what it thinks is a shelter, it gets covered in pollen and then discovers this is not a shelter at all. So it flies out again and tries to find new shelter. And in that way, brings pollen from plant to plant without actually taking any pollen back from its nest. And these are mainly male bees that you see in the pictures here. So they would not be collecting pollen for their nest. Another way that plants can trick bees or pollinators is by what we call sexual deception or sexual mimicry. So for example, this orchid produces sex pheromones, or produces something that smells like sex pheromones to the male Colletes calicularis that you see in the image here. So the male bee tries to mate with the orchid because he thinks it's a female bee, but then obviously that doesn't work very well. So he flies on to the next flower, and by doing this, he brings pollen between flowers. So the flower doesn't lose anything in the pollination system, pollinator system. So these are two different ways that the pollinators or plants can adapt to pollinators. They can either adapt by targeting rewards and attracting the correct pollinators in a way that sort of is mutually beneficial. The pollinator gets some, the plant gets some, but they can also trick the pollinator, which is probably more efficient. Now, in parallel with the evolution of plants and different reproductive systems in plants, obviously the bees have also kept up with this arms race, or tried to keep up with this arms race in order to adapt to plants. So, for example, we've got the long tongues and the bees so that they can access the floral rewards. But bees can also adapt behaviorally. So you can see that you've got bees that may circumvent this long nectar spur by really diving into the flowers. You've got tiny bees like Hylia species that just go for the pollen. You see it naps off the pollen on the top of the flower here. These Hylia species are almost hairless, so they wouldn't really contribute much to pollination. They collect the pollen in their crop. And then you've got species, or a lot of bees, that also bite holes into the nectar spurs of the plants and thereby can suck out the nectar from the corolla without contributing to pollination. Now, in addition to sort of behavioral evolutions or adaptations or adaptations of different tongue lengths, bees have also developed different pollen collecting mechanisms. So if you collect pollen from asters, for example, that have very, very small pollen, we saw some very nice pictures of pollen from Natuska earlier on, and you saw that there's a huge variation in what pollen grains can look like. Bees that collect pollen from asters, for example, they can collect it either wet, so that they collect pollen and then spit a lot of nectar on it, so the pollen can stick to even very simple hairs, like in this picture here. Another mechanism, if the bee prefers or collects pollen dry, then bees tend to have evolved more plumose or more hairy, sort of feather-like pollen collecting hairs, so that the bees have sort of adapted to the type of pollen they specialize on by adapting or by evolving specific pollen collecting mechanisms. So there's a very sort of fine evolution going on here in the bees. Another aspect of adaptation is the adaptation to toxic pollens. because a lot of pollen is actually toxic to bees. For example, Ranunculus or buttercups is quite toxic to a lot of species. Also, asters, pollen from asters or asteraceae can also be toxic. So in Calides species, for example, where we have quite a lot of bees that collect pollen from asteraceae, we see that the bees that actually collect the majority of the pollen, or whose pollen sort of diet is mainly composed of asteraceae, they tend also to be highly specialized on asteraceae, whereas generalized bees within that genus, they tend to collect a lot less asteraceae, so they tend to avoid it. So even within fairly closely related bees, you see a segregation in terms of the adaptation to toxic pollen. Also within osmias, like Osmia bicornis you see in the picture here, and its close relative Osmia cornuta, researchers have done trials where they grow larvae on different types of pollen. And there you can see the Osmia bicornis, that bees there survive quite well on ranuncular pollen, buttercup pollen, that's the gray line. Whereas for Osmia cornuta, you see that the survival day is very low, that after just 20 days, no more bees were alive after being fed on ranunculus. So the pollen chemistry and pollen toxicity and adaptation to that is also an important adaptation within bees. So because of these sort of evolutions from the flowers to attract different bees and trick different bees, and also from the bees side in terms of behavioral preferences to plants, ability to extract different resources, either pollen or nectar, and to carry pollen, we see that bees segregate in terms of which plants they visit. So for example, Chilostoma rapunculi here from Denmark mainly or only collects pollen from buttercups. So you can see it's scraping off the pollen here from the anther in the middle here. And Andrena nigriceps and denticulata are specialized on asteraceae. Andrena hattorfiana on, I think it's called knapweed, Knausia avensis, rødknap in Norwegian. And then we have our Dasypode hirchipes on yellow asters, which only collects pollen there, but you also see females collecting nectar from other plants. So even though we see there's a pollen system, there's also sort of a nectar system, and there's a lot of cheating going on, but we do see some general patterns in which plants provide resources for different types of bees. Now, in order to apply this in conservation, that also means that we also have to think in terms of the other resources that these species require. I'm just going to show the same slide that Yoko showed earlier on from our Metacarpnet project, where our aim is to see if we can predict where in the landscape that different types of flowers, different species of flowers, will receive the most visits and be the most important to different species of bees. Now, the idea here is that we have some species that nest in sandy soils, for example, and we have other species that don't. So for example, in this case, from this study, we mainly have solitary bees that are, well, where the majority of the ones collected nest in sandy soils. And then we have a lot of bumblebees collected that don't nest in sandy soils, but nest in mouse holes and rodent holes and other places. So with the data we've collected here, and this paper has just been accepted for publication, so it should be, and it is in press now, so it should be available online in a couple of days. We have attempted to show how we can model this and produce maps showing where it would make the most sense to, for example, cater for bees that prefer asteraceae or composite flowers. So from our study landscape here around Gardermoen Airport, our prediction model shows that the bee species richness that you would expect to visit flowers of asteraceae is highest, that's the very bright yellow colors here, is highest at and around Gardermoen on grassy fields. So that's the grassy areas here in Gardermoen. Now, this entire area here that I'm sort of trying to draw up on the picture here is very sand dominated. So there's a lot of sand in the soil here, where in areas here where you've got agriculture, you've got more marine sediments and more clay-rich sediments, so they're not so suitable for ground nesting bees. For leguminosas or legumes or Fabaceae plants, We also see that we get quite a good or high species richness of bees on sandy areas, but we also see that we actually get the most in areas that are on these marine soils. So what this here shows is that, well, the solitary bees, which are the main Asteraceae visitors, as Joko also showed from the data collected from Denmark, they are sort of concentrated towards sandy soils, whereas the legume visitors, which in our case is mainly bumblebees, is more sort of focused around the border between sandy and marine areas, where you have quite a bit of semi-natural landscape or vegetation around. So in this part of the region. So this here is mainly sort of a proof of concept of our method, and we're in the next year we will be working with the data that we've collected from Denmark and Norway this year to upscale this model and make maps like this for southeastern Norway and for western Denmark, to see if we can sort of identify where floral visits are highest. And then Anders and his people at Nibio have been working on identifying the pollen limitation in plants in these areas. So can we actually use our maps to also see where the pollination of plants is the most secure? So that's the next stage of our project. So with that, I'd like to thank all of, well, first of all, thank all of you for listening. And then thank all our collaborators, Katrine Eldegaard at NMBU, Anders Nielsen at Nibio, our colleagues at Miljødirektoratet, Stein Joar Hækland at Høgskolen på Vestlandet, Joko, Claus and Jens Mons Olsen at Aarhus University, Trond Reitan at University of Oslo, our funders at Forskningsrådet, the Norwegian Research Council, and our contacts at Viken Fylkeskommune, and then Henning Bang Madsen from Copenhagen University, who's identified the bees sampled in Denmark and who's also on the project. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Marcus. We have a small amount of time for questions, if there are any. There is a question in the Q&A. I'm not sure if it's for you, but they ask, how can pollen be toxic to a bee species? Does it depend on the composition of the pollen when consumed? That is a very interesting aspect.
As far as I understood it, it depends quite a bit. Some pollen can be toxic because the lipids on the outside of the pollen is very tough to digest, or it's tough for the bees to digest it. So for example, in the honeybees, they need specific bacteria to digest some of the lipids in the protein layer of the pollen, or in the cape of the cloak or the shell of the pollen. So some of it is probably physiological things with the pollen that make it hard to just digest. Other pollen have spikes, which might not be good for the bee gut. But honestly, this is not my field, so I don't know. I actually do not know all the different mechanisms by which pollen can be toxic. But you could say that there are different hypotheses for why pollen is toxic. One hypothesis is that the toxicity in pollen is just chemical compounds that's found in the plant, and which will also be found in the pollen. So that's one sort of hypothesis, just a spillover. Another hypothesis is that, well, if the plant wants to attract the correct pollinator, then it could make sure that the pollen is basically very toxic, but that the right pollinator is adapted to it. So that's sort of to avoid wasting pollen on non-efficient pollinators. So there are different hypotheses about why some pollen is toxic. But we do see it in the buttercups, which is a very sort of ancestral group within the Oedocots. So it seems to be an old thing.
Great. Thank you so much. That was the time we had for you. And your presentation will be available online after one of the
Absolutely. I'd like to update it once our paper is published, so I can provide the correct link for it, if that's okay.
Yes, that is no problem. So everyone who wants to take something out or update it in any way, just let us know, so we won't put them online before they're completely ready. So again, thank you so much, Marcus. We said we were supposed to be done at 2 o'clock, and I intend to keep that promise. So I'm not going to be talking for long, but I need to say something too, just to end this whole webinar. So, well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone presenting. It has been so interesting to listen to all of you talk, and I have learned so much new information, and I bet everyone who's been listening has learned at least one new thing from today, and that is kind of our goal in this project, that we want to learn from each other and see what the different countries are doing when we try to make it better for the wild pollinators and try to do measures for them. It's great to collaborate on these things so we can learn from each other and see what works in this country and what doesn't work in this country. And we'll use this knowledge so we can be more efficient in both the research, but also when we talk about wild pollinators. I have just a few slides in my PowerPoint presentation that I want to share with you. So this is from the break. Let's see, I hope everyone can see this. Yes, good. So we have been working with other things in this project as well as this webinar. So the webinar is just a part of it, although it's a big part of the project. But we have the theme Flowers for Pollinators this year, and that's because we want to have a lot of focus on, well, flowers for pollinators. It is one of the measures that are resulting in very positive results for when we want to manage or when we want to conserve and promote wild pollinators. And in Norway, we have this blomstermeny. We talked some about this in the last year's webinar. And it is a list of different plant species people can plant out, even if they just have a small garden or a balcony where you can put out some flowering pots, or if you have a bigger farm or managing larger areas. And the list is completed with a lot of different flowers, both more garden flowers or wildflowers, bushes and trees. They're not invasive or have the potential to cause damage to the nature in Norway. And they also produce a lot of nectar and pollen for the pollinators. And we're not making a new blomstermeny in this project, but we are making more like for the Nordic and the Baltic area. We're taking some plants that are common for all these countries, and we're suggesting which plants you can plant out, and also how to recognize the different seeds, and in general more information about wild pollinators and how to promote them. So we're making this brochure, and it's currently just in Norwegian, but it is under development, so it will become available in English and hopefully in also Danish, Swedish, Finnish and Estonian at some point. So we are making an evaluation form that we want to send out to all of you which have participated today, and so you can come with some feedback, and you can also mention if you want to have this brochure sent to you digitally when it's done. We are also making a poster, which is as good as finalized now. It's just very, very few finishing touches left, which we have made more specifically for farmers, and we've called it Farmers Caring for Pollinators. And we have made some points to what we can do on your farm in order to do measures for pollinators. It is very inspired by the poster, which was presented by Anne at the first presentation, with what the Danish farmers could do for bees. So we have taken some of that inspiration, but we have also included the different seasons and made some points to each season that we think is important if you want to do some measures for the wild pollinators. If you weren't with us last year, or if you think you want to watch it again, we have some information on that too. On youtube.com/lahumlasuse, you can find the entire webinar recording from last year. There you can also find a bit.ly link promoting pollinators, where you can find all of the presentations, just the PowerPoint presentations of the presenters last year. And we also made a brochure called Promoting Pollinators in Agriculture, which is the Nordic Baltic Guide to Measures for Wild Pollinators. This is also online and also in Norwegian and English. So if that is interesting for anyone, it is available to everyone to find. And with that, I just again want to say thank you so much to all of their presenters, and of course to everyone watching from home. It's been great to see so many actually participating. At some point there were over 200, and it actually kept to be almost 200 for most of the webinar, which has been very, very great to see. So also a big thank you to everyone who has planned this webinar, including Monica and Frauke, and Annika, Anneli, Jørgen, Bjørn, Tracy. I think that was all the names. I hope I didn't forget anyone there. We couldn't, of course, have not done this without you, and it's been great hosting this for me. And are there any last information I need to say? I don't think so. So we will be sending out the evaluation form at some point to everyone who participated, so you can reach us on the same email if you have any more questions. And it's 1 minute to 2, so I kept my promise. And once again, thank you so much. And I hope to see you all at some other points. Have a great day.